The crime at the center of today's story is considered to be one of the most disturbing and heinous of all time. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please ask the follow button to come to the zoo with you, and then when you're there, accidentally spill honey all over them and then push them into the bear enclosure. Okay, let's get into today's story. Austin Harif was born on December 21st, 1996, to a dentist and a pharmacist. They lived in a beautiful home in Palm Beach County, Florida, which is not only one of the nicest and wealthiest places to live in Florida, but it is one of the nicest and wealthiest places to live in all of America. And that's why, as of 2021, there are 44 billionaires that call this paradise their home. In 2010, when Austin was 13 years old, his parents suddenly got divorced, and within the same calendar year, both of his parents had new girlfriends and boyfriends. Now, of course, this was a shock to Austin and to his 1 year younger sister Haley, but they both relatively quickly adjusted to their new normal. And that was in large part because the kids didn't move out. They stayed in the family home with their mom, and their father, he did move out, but he moved into a home that was very close by. About a year after the divorce, Austin began high school, and immediately he excelled. He was placed into all advanced classes, and within these advanced classes, Austin was consistently at the top of his class. Austin was also a big athletic guy. He was about 6 feet tall and weighed about 200 pounds, and so naturally, he played football for all 4 years he was in high school, and for 1 year, his sophomore year, he also wrestled. But despite his size and willingness to play these very rough physical sports, Austin was not an aggressive guy. In fact, his football coaches actually used to criticize him for not being aggressive enough. And on game days, they would try to make him mad in hopes that would inspire him to go out there and smash some people. But it really didn't work because Austin was Austin. He was just kind of a laid-back guy who was actually much more interested in helping people than smashing them. In fact, towards the end of high school, Austin became obsessed with trying to identify a career that would allow him to help the most people. And he was so passionate about this that when he spoke about it, a huge smile would kind of involuntarily appear on his face. And so because of this, and because of Austin's generally happy disposition, his father very lovingly began referring to him as the happy boy. Shortly before Austin's graduation in 2015, he received a letter in the mail from Florida State University, and it was informing him he had been accepted into their 4-year pre-med program. Austin had settled on medicine as being his intended career path to help the most people, and so being accepted into this very prestigious program was like a best-case scenario. And so Austin and his family were elated, and that summer that followed his high school graduation was totally charmed. Austin was on cloud 9, he spent a lot of time with his family and his friends, and then finally at the end of the summer, his family packed all of his stuff into the car, and they drove 6 hours north to Tallahassee where the Florida State campus was. They helped move him into his dorm, and then afterwards they gave him a big hug, said good luck, and they left. And I'm sure on their ride back, the family members thought to themselves, Austin is doing so great, he is not only ready for college, he is ready to be an adult. He's ready to live on his own and be responsible. And at the end of Austin's first year in college, that supposition about him ready to be an adult seemed to be accurate. Austin got excellent grades, he met a nice girlfriend, and even though he wasn't playing organized sports like football, he had found another athletic outlet in bodybuilding. And he had actually built a decent-sized social media presence around bodybuilding and fitness. But underneath all of this public success Austin was having that year, he was actually struggling a lot of the time, he just wasn't telling anyone. In a journal he kept, he documented a deep sense of inadequacy caused primarily from his sense that his peers didn't accept him. And so he would write endlessly about how if he could just stop being so shy and be more assertive and outgoing, that more people would embrace him and would like him and would accept him. Over the course of that year, Austin also started abusing different substances. Those included things like alcohol, marijuana, and Vyvanse. Vyvanse is a drug that is a stimulant, and it's used to treat people with attention deficit disorder. He also experimented with hallucinogenic drugs like acid and mushrooms, and he also tried MDMA, which is kind of like a cross between a stimulant and a hallucinogenic. And those are just the drugs that we are aware he was taking. It's entirely possible he was taking other drugs too. Regardless, Austin began oscillating between the high of whatever drug or combination of drugs he was on to the low of his sober mind, which was totally saturated with anxious and depressive thoughts. Before the end of the school year, Austin was secretly poised for a full-blown mental breakdown, and it seemed like he knew it was coming too. In the last month before the end of school, his internet search history is filled with questions like, "I think I'm crazy, what do I do?" And "How do you know if you're crazy?" And "How to deal with obsessive thoughts?" And "Do I need to sleep?" And "What happens if you don't sleep?" It was clear he was starting to question his own sanity. When Austin finally returned back home from Florida State that summer, his family immediately noticed there was something wrong with Austin. Within a few days of being home, Austin had moved his bed from his bedroom down into the garage, claiming that the reason he did this was because the house was full of demons. At night, instead of sleeping, Austin would patrol the house. He would literally just walk all around the house all night, never stopping, and every 2 hours, he would knock on the bedroom doors of his family members and loudly announce that he was guarding them from the demons in the house. Now, you can imagine how his family felt at the time. This was so unbelievably weird and totally out of character that they just didn't really know what to do. Even though it was obvious there was something wrong, they didn't jump into action. Instead, the only thing they did at first was to just start locking their bedroom doors at night to prevent Austin from coming inside during his nighttime patrols. But as the summer progressed and Austin continued to act totally weird with no explanation, his family began to become convinced that he must be on drugs, that is what would explain all of this totally strange behavior. And so when they confronted him about his drug use, he would admit that he was taking drugs, lots of different drugs, psychedelics, stimulants, you name it. He's taking all these drugs. And so naturally, his family latched on to his drug use as being the root cause of his very strange behavior. And so they focused their efforts almost exclusively on getting Austin clean again. But towards the end of the summer, Austin said he wasn't taking any drugs, but Austin was still acting totally crazy and unhinged. And so around mid-August, the family decided they had to utilize something called the Baker Act. Under the Baker Act, individuals in Florida who are suspected of severe mental illness can be detained for up to 72 hours at the behest of their loved ones. And during these 72 hours, this individual is thoroughly assessed to see what's going on with them. And then at the end of those 72 hours, they are given a treatment plan that their family is supposed to help them enact. But before the family could utilize the Baker Act, something horrific happened. On the morning of August 15th, one of Austin's very close friends, who he had known since second grade, said Austin just showed up at his house without calling ahead of time or letting him know, which was very uncharacteristic. And when this friend opened the door to see what Austin wanted, Austin just asked him, "What year was I born?" And so the friend says, 1996? And as soon as Austin heard this, he didn't give a reaction to it. He just turned around and he left. And so this longtime friend is looking at Austin walking away, wondering, what's going on with this guy? Is he high on drugs? Is he drunk? What was that? So the friend goes back inside his house and he's thinking to himself, what should I do? And so after a couple of minutes, he decides, I gotta call Austin and make sure he's okay. So he calls Austin picks up, and it's unclear what they talked about on the phone, but the friend convinced Austin to come back to his house and to just spend the day with him. But really, the friend just wanted to make sure Austin was okay. And so Austin comes back to the friend's house, and then the two of them actually would leave the house and meet up with some of their other friends that were in town that summer, as well as meet up with Austin's sister. And so the group, they decide they're going to go to the beach for the day. And on their walk to the beach, Austin tells the group that he just needs to get something at his house and that he will meet them down at the water. And so at this point, the group believes Austin is just fine. So they say, okay, yep, we'll meet you down there. So Austin breaks off. He goes to his house. And when he goes back to the beach and meets up with his group of friends again, he's changed his outfit. He was now wearing this very thick, large football jersey. He was wearing long sweatpants that were also very thick. He had on 2 wristwatches and he had on sunglasses. And so as he walks down onto the beach, his friends look up at him and it's super hot out and they're at the beach. So this is a totally weird outfit to have on. And immediately they start kind of giving him crap about his strange outfit choice. But Austin did not think it was funny at all. And at first he was quiet, but then he kind of lashed out and said, if you tell me I'm crazy, I will kill you. And at this, his friends did not give him any more crap. Everyone just said, okay, man, hey, didn't mean anything by it. Just giving you a hard time. No big deal. But Austin's like clearly worked up. And so his sister comes over to him and she's like, hey, calm down. It's okay. It's not a big deal. And during this conversation, Austin suddenly goes back to being normal again. And he turns to his sister and he says, I'm actually half horse and I'm immortal. And his sister's like, what? You really need to get professional help. You need to see a therapist or a psychologist or something. Something is wrong with you and it's been wrong all summer. You need to get help. Now, apparently, Austin actually responded to this very positively. And he said, I agree. There is something going on and I do need to get help. You're right. And so after that, Austin and the rest of the group, they stayed at the beach for several hours. And then in the evening time, Austin, his sister, and Austin's very close friend, who was the guy that saw Austin in the morning when he asked, what year was I born, they all said they had to leave. And so the trio, they leave the beach and they head to Duffy's, which was a restaurant in town. And they were going there to meet up with Austin's father and his father's girlfriend. And so as they're getting to this restaurant, they're walking along the sidewalk, they're nearing this restaurant, when suddenly Austin turns to his sister and says, hey, I need to test out my immortality. And he just turns away from her, away from the sidewalk, towards traffic, and just starts walking into traffic, like he's gonna let a car hit him to test his immortality. And so his sister immediately was able to grab him and pulled him back onto the sidewalk, and then basically stood on the left side of him, preventing him from running out into traffic, and kind of pushed him along up the sidewalk right up to the front door of this restaurant. And when they got there, Austin had stopped trying to walk out into traffic. He was acting normal again. And it was there that the trio met up with Austin's father and his father's girlfriend, and the 5 of them went into Duffy's restaurant. It was about 7:45 p.m. when they got inside, and they were very quickly sat in the very back of the restaurant in this booth. And so there was a CCTV camera that watched them while they were inside this building. And so they're sitting at this booth, and about 3 minutes after having sat down, Austin gets up and walks away from the booth and walks as if he's going towards the bathroom, but then stops, doesn't go to the bathroom, turns around and walks back towards the front of the building, and then walks out the front doors, just leaves the restaurant altogether. Now, it's unclear if the rest of his family saw him do this. It doesn't seem like they did. But just a minute later, Austin comes back inside the restaurant and just walks right back to his table and sits down like nothing had ever happened. Less than 10 minutes later, Austin would get up again from his table, except this time, instead of feigning going to the bathroom, he just walks straight from his table right out the front doors of the restaurant and disappears. A couple minutes later, Austin's mother, who was not at dinner with them, she was at her home, which happened to be nearby this restaurant. She was home when she heard the sound of someone coming into her house. And so she went around to see who it was, and she found her son, Austin, in her kitchen, drinking vegetable oil, and there was Parmesan cheese all over the counter that apparently he had been eating as well. And so she runs up to him and she grabs the vegetable oil and she puts it down and she tells him to stop, at which point Austin does stop. And then I guess Austin just went up to his room and he changed out of his clothes because perhaps he got oil all over his shirt. And then his mom just drove him back to the restaurant. And so she watched him get out of the car and she watched him go through the front door and then she drove off. And so about 30 minutes after he left that second time, Austin walks through the front doors of the restaurant. He's got a different shirt on, different hat on, and he just walks to the back of the restaurant where his sister, his friend, and his father's girlfriend are. And he sits down like nothing had ever happened. At first, it looks like everyone at the table is just silent. But then Austin's father very clearly said something to Austin, and it seems kind of hostile. And it would turn out Austin's father, who loved his son, was just totally at a loss for what to do with him. And he said to Austin when he sat back down, "What is wrong with you?" And at this, Austin just stands up and presses his father's face back up against his seat, kind of pinning him there. And then at some point, he just lets go, he leaves the booth, and he walks right out of the restaurant for a third time. Austin's friend, who was eating with them, he got up and kind of chased after Austin, but he was about 30 seconds behind him, and so by the time he got outside, he didn't know where Austin went, and so he quickly came back in the restaurant. He told the rest of the group he didn't know where Austin was, and so at this point, Austin's father's girlfriend would actually call the police and report Austin missing. They knew he was totally unhinged, and they didn't know where he was going to go, if he was a threat to himself or someone else, and so they figured they should just tell the police and have the police go find him. About 4 miles away from this restaurant, 53-year-old Michelle Mishcon was sitting in her garage watching TV. Normally, she would be joined by her husband, 59-year-old John Stevens, but he was out walking their dog, so for the time being, Michelle was alone. The couple had been married for roughly 20 years, they had 3 kids together from previous marriages, and they were just totally in love with each other. That garage was like their happy place. That was basically like their living room. They loved having the door wide open so they could wave to neighbors and flag people down to have a drink with them or just chat with them. They were just known to be a very happy, loving couple that were fun to be around. And according to their kids, they had both recently retired. John retired from his landscaping company that he owned, and Michelle retired from her financial advisory job. And the two of them were apparently both just really excited about retirement life. They were excited to spend more time together and go out with their friends and go out fishing on their boat with their dog, and then also spend as much time as they could just lounging back in their garage. John and Michelle's neighbor across the street was a middle-aged man named Jeff Fisher. Jeff was fairly close with the couple. He would usually watch their dogs anytime they went away, and he would often go in their garage and have a drink and just kind of hang out with them. And so this particular night, he was over in his house and he was going to bed early. So he laid down in his bed, he's getting ready to go to sleep, when he hears some strange sounds coming from outside his window across the street over near John and Michelle's property. And so Jeff sits up in his bed and kind of strains his ears to see what it was that he heard. And as he's trying to listen for some faint sound, he suddenly hears a blood-curdling scream, a woman's scream, coming from across the street. And so Jeff instantly leapt into action. He jumped out of his bed, he ran downstairs, and he ran out his front door, and he looked across the street, and he saw this unknown man, some young man that was slamming the car door of Michelle's car that was parked in her driveway, and he begins walking up the driveway, and at the top of the driveway, Jeff sees Michelle is standing in the garage, and she looks totally terrified, and she's facing this unknown young man. And of course, this unknown young man was Austin Harif. Now, Jeff had no idea what was actually going on. All he knew was he heard this scream, which was probably Michelle, and he's looking out there and he's seeing a situation that just doesn't look good. And so instinctively, he decided he would just run across the street and make sure Michelle was okay. And if he had to, he would confront this unknown man, Austin. So Jeff begins running across his property, trying to get across the street to Michelle, but before he could even get across the street, he's looking up and he can see this guy, Austin, has grabbed Michelle and thrown her on the ground, and now he's on top of her and he's beating her. And so Jeff runs onto the driveway, and as he's going right up the driveway between the 2 cars that were parked there, Austin leaps off of Michelle. He turns around and he looks at Jeff and he says, "You don't want a part of this." And now Jeff, he's a pretty big guy, and so he's looking at Austin, and he knows that if he doesn't do anything, this guy is just going to continue pummeling poor Michelle, and he had no idea where John was, and so he ran up and kind of lunged at Austin, and as he did that, Austin swung, and he hit Jeff right across the side of the head. But Jeff took the hit, he didn't fall down, he grabbed Austin by the collar and threw him as hard as he could to the ground, and Austin, he hit the pavement hard, face first. And so Jeff is looking at this guy, kind of thinking he's not going to get up. But as he's assessing the situation, watching Austin stand back up again, Jeff suddenly feels a blinding pain in his face, in the side of his head, in his neck, on his back. And he looks down and he sees blood all over his arms. It's everywhere. He's covered in blood. It would turn out Austin was carrying a knife. And so when he punched Jeff, that knife went into his face. It cut the side of his head, it cut his neck, and it cut his back. He had 5 different puncture points from that one swing. And so Jeff believed at the time this was a potentially fatal wound. He was worried perhaps his jugular had been struck and he was bleeding to death. And he's seeing Austin stand back up, coming right after him with this knife. And so Jeff decides their only chance is for him to run and call the police. And so he runs into Michelle's property. He's thinking that he's kind of drawing this guy towards him away from Michelle. He runs into their property, kind of slams into all their doors. He goes out a back door and then he loops around the property and then he makes a run for it straight across the street to his house. Never once did he turn around to see if this guy was after him. He figured he was right behind him. He gets to his house, he runs inside, he locks the door, and then he calls 911. After the call is placed and Jeff is certain that help is on the way, he's barely conscious, but all he can remember thinking was, I hope this maniac, Austin, has abandoned his attack and just run off. Or, I hope John has come outside and he's helping his wife. But unfortunately, all Jeff could hear was the sound of Austin across the street making these loud, animalistic grunting sounds. And at the same time, he hears the sound of someone screaming at the top of their lungs. He doesn't even know if it's one person, if it's two people, if it's male, if it's female. All he hears is screams and grunting sounds. And then seconds later, the police show up. The following narrative is the account of the second responding officer, who we'll just call Dan, and the first responding officer we'll just call Kristen. And so Dan, he comes flying down the street, he's got his sirens on, and he pulls in right behind Kristen's cop car, which is parked right out in front of John and Michelle's property. Kristen is already running up the driveway. Her gun is out. She's getting ready to engage somebody at the top of the driveway. And so Dan, he hops out of his car. He's got his hand on his gun. And as he turns to run up the driveway, his view is obscured. There are two cars parked in the driveway. And so he can't see what's at the top of the driveway that Kristen is apparently getting ready to draw her gun on. But as he begins running up the driveway, he sees there is this massive 6-foot wide stream of blood just coming down the driveway. And so he goes around the left side of the left car, he goes up and he sees Kristen right at the top of the driveway. She's got her gun aimed at the ground right in front of the car, so he can't see what's in front of the car yet. He comes bombing around the left side right behind Kristen and he looks down at what she's aiming her gun at and he sees there's this man lying on the ground. His eyes are open. He's just laying there kind of stiff and he's looking up at Kristen and he's looking up at Dan and he's just quietly saying, "Please help me." The man on the ground was John Stevens, and on top of John Stevens was Austin. He was kind of laying sideways on John's chest. He had his left arm wrapped around John's neck to kind of hold him in place, and then he had his right arm and he was doing something to John's face. But Dan couldn't really tell what he was doing. All he could take in was there was clearly an aggressor, and they needed to get him off of the victim. But Kristen could not take the shot, because if she did, she ran the risk of firing the bullet through Austin into John, killing John. And so Dan tells Kristen, "Hold on, I'm going to tase him." And so he moves around Kristen to her left side, so he's positioned looking down at the back of Austin. He pulls out his taser, and right before he shoots his taser into Austin's back, he sees what Austin is doing to John's face. With his free right hand, he was reaching into John's mouth and pulling his cheek out, kind of like a fish hook. He was pulling it out as far as he could, and then he was biting into John's cheek, and he was ripping out pieces of flesh and chewing and swallowing them. And from his position, Dan only saw this for a second, but he suddenly noticed, and Kristen, the other officer, would later confirm, there were all these chunks already missing from John's face. And so Dan kind of snapped out of what he was seeing and fired his taser into the back of Austin, but it did nothing. It had absolutely no effect. Austin was entirely focused on biting John's face. That was all he was doing. He wasn't even registering that there were cops with their guns drawn on him. It was like they weren't even there. And so Dan runs back around Kristen to the other side of her. He's now on her right side, so he's standing right next to the car, looking down at Austin's front. And he tells Kristen to kind of back up for a second, and then Dan winds up and kicks Austin square in the face, knocking his head off of John's face. But as soon as Austin comes off of John, he doesn't get up and try to fight with Dan. Instead, he just jumps back down, gets a deeper grip on John, and plunges his mouth back onto John's face. And so again, Dan winds up and boots Austin square in the face, knocking his head back. But again, he's totally unfazed. He doesn't want to attack the officers. He just wants to eat John's face. And so he goes right back down, gets a tighter grip. He goes back and he starts chewing on John's face again. And so Dan was just repeatedly kicking him in the face over and over and over again, right as another set of officers showed up, and they had a canine, they had a dog. And so they come flying up, they kind of see the situation, and Dan tells them, release the dog. And so sure enough, they release the canine. The canine clamps down on Austin's right arm, the arm that was fish hooking and kind of pulling John's face out. And the dog really got a good bite on his arm and yanked it away from John's face. But Austin just instantly ripped his arm back, doing severe damage to his arm from the dog's teeth, and just repositioned himself and went back to biting John's face. And so the dog, just as it was trained, did another bite. It grabbed back onto Austin's arm, and Austin, again, unfazed, just yanked his arm out of the dog's teeth, again shredding the muscles of his arm, and gets back in position and continues to eat John's face. And then finally, the dog gets another bite into Austin's arm, and this time when the dog managed to yank Austin's arm away from John, Dan timed it so he booted Austin square in the face right as his arm was being pulled back, and he hit him hard enough that Austin actually flew off of John and landed on his back. And as soon as he was on the ground, Dan actually leapt over John and landed on Austin's face, smashing his head into the cement, which kind of stunned him for a second. And as soon as he was stunned, Dan whipped out his handcuffs, threw it over one of Austin's wrists, and began pulling him by the handcuff up the driveway away from John. But as soon as he had some separation and Dan went to put the other handcuff on Austin, Austin began fighting back, and he looked up at Dan and he screamed, "Kill me! I'm eating humans! Kill me!" Dan didn't even know what to do, and so he's trying to put the other handcuff on him the whole time. Austin is screaming, "Kill me! Kill me!" And so other officers had to run in, and then finally, after 3 other officers came over, they were able to hold Austin down long enough to get both handcuffs on him. After Austin was finally restrained, the officers checked on the victims. They checked on Michelle, who was in the garage, and unfortunately, she was deceased. She had died from blunt force trauma. And John, even though he had been alive when the police first showed up, he had succumbed to the multitude of injuries he had sustained, from stabbings to beatings to having a portion of his face ripped off. It's believed after John came back from his walk, which would have been right after Jeff had been attacked and ran back to his house, John saw Austin in his garage attacking his wife, and John ran in to try to save her. So ultimately, John would die trying to save the woman that he loved. Their dog would survive the attack. It was unharmed, and it was given to one of their children to take care of. And Jeff Fisher, the neighbor who tried to save John and Michelle, he would survive the attack and make a full recovery. After Austin was finally handcuffed and was laying restrained on the driveway, he suddenly became unresponsive. He was rushed to the hospital, where it was determined he had drank some poisonous chemicals, most likely from inside of John and Michelle's garage, and that was what was causing his organs to fail. Ultimately, Austin would go into a coma for 11 days from whatever he ingested, but the doctors were able to save his life, and so he would come out of that coma and he would make a full physical recovery. It was initially assumed that because of Austin's drug abuse history, that he must have been on some drug when he perpetrated this heinous crime. It was speculated that he could have been on bath salts or flakka, which are these synthetic hallucinogenic drugs which are very powerful, and at the time they were quite popular in Florida, and they'd caused some other users to go on these kind of wild, violent rampages. And so it seemed to make a lot of sense that he must have been on one of those. But when Austin's toxicology report finally came back, it showed he only had a very small amount of THC in his system, which is the drug found in marijuana, and then the other drugs that were in his system were all induced by the doctors and nurses at the hospital, which meant at the time of this attack, Austin was effectively sober. When the police asked Austin, "Why did you do this?" he initially said, "I don't remember, I don't know," but eventually he would open up and he would tell this story that no sane person could possibly understand. He said after he left that restaurant where his family was that third time after he fought with his father and he stormed out, after that, he saw this dark figure outside with a white face, and he knew immediately that this figure was evil. And so instinctively, Austin began running away from this evil figure. And so he ran about 4 miles into John and Michelle's neighborhood. And when he got to this neighborhood, a neighborhood he was not familiar with, that he didn't intend to go to on purpose, he just kind of wound up there. He said he saw this brightly lit up garage and he ran up into it believing he could enlist the help of the people inside of this house and that they would help him defeat this evil figure that was lurking somewhere nearby. And so he runs up into this garage, which happens to be John and Michelle's garage, and Michelle is in there. John is not. He's out for the walk with his dog, and Austin approaches her and tries to get her to help him, but he probably came off looking completely insane, and Michelle screamed. At which point, Austin said he believed Michelle was a witch, and so he pulled out his knife and he attacked her. And then after she fell to the ground, Austin said he drank a bottle of alcohol or something, which we now know was most likely very poisonous lawn chemicals that was just in the garage. After he drinks that bottle, he turns around and now he's looking out of the garage towards the street. And he said he saw this other figure in the doorway with a dog next to him. And then Austin said his mind just went blank. It's believed the figure he saw in the doorway was John Stevens returning from his walk, but we don't know for sure, and frankly, this story is pretty incoherent to begin with, because it doesn't account for the fact that before John came back, Austin had been grappling with Jeff Fisher and stabbing Jeff Fisher, the neighbor. But Austin would say he has no recollection of encountering Jeff Fisher, he has no recollection of John or what he looked like, and he certainly doesn't remember biting John's face, and he had no memory of any interactions with police. He said that basically he turned around, he sees this figure, this dog, and then his mind went blank, and then he woke up about 2 weeks later in the hospital. Now, when his story went public, a lot of people just were not willing to accept that story. They said he was making it up so he could plead insanity at his trial and get a lesser sentence. But a world-renowned forensic psychologist named Philip Resnick, who had worked on many high-profile cases before, he did a lengthy assessment of Austin, and he came to a very different conclusion than the public. In his 38-page report, Resnick points out the fact that Austin continued to bite John's face even when he was being openly threatened with being shot by the police officer standing right over him. He continued to bite John's face after he was tased. He continued to bite John's face after he was kicked in the head repeatedly. He continued to bite John's face after a dog repeatedly bit him. This all suggests that Austin was truly in a psychotic state when this attack occurred. A sane person, even under the influence of drugs, will retain a basic survival instinct. They will try to protect themselves. So when there are guns pointed at them, or they're being physically harmed, or there's threats of violence, they'll do things to protect themselves. But Austin didn't. It was like he had no idea about anything else except John's face. Resnick specified that the type of psychotic episode that Austin was suffering from on the night of the attack is something called clinical lycanthropy delusions. Clinical lycanthropy is a very rare occurrence where an individual believes they are no longer human, and almost always what they believe they are is something akin to a werewolf. And in Austin's case, it's not that hard to figure out why you might reach that type of conclusion. He had told his sister that he believed he was half horse, and then on a couple other occasions he had told his other friends that he believed he was half dog. And then of course, on the night of the attack, after he killed Michelle, he pounced literally on John and began eating his face while making those loud animalistic grunting sounds. This is behavior that is certainly on par with what you would expect a werewolf to do in a movie. But this was not a movie, this was real life. After Austin came out of his coma, but before he had been transferred to jail, he agreed to do an interview with the clinical psychologist, TV personality Phil McGraw, better known as Dr. Phil. And during their 10-minute Zoom interview, Austin would break down and cry and say he was incredibly sorry to the family of the victims, that he didn't really know why it happened, and that clearly there was something wrong with him and he needed help, and he just hoped they could find it in their hearts to eventually forgive him. But it's unlikely the family of the victims are going to forgive him anytime soon, especially when you consider they came out in an interview and said, "I hope Austin makes a full recovery from his coma, that he has no brain damage, that he is totally A-okay, so he can be fully aware and lucid when they read him his sentence." A sentence they hoped would be the death penalty. As of 2022, a judge has found Austin Harrouff not guilty by reason of insanity. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. Not just this one, but also Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Run Fool, and Wartime Stories. To find them, all you have to do is look up Ballen Studios on any podcast platform, and boom, you'll find them all. If you want to watch hundreds more stories just like the one you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 2 horror stories about manipulative people who twisted other people's faith into fear. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called The New Nanny, and it's about a very busy family who tries to hire a new nanny for their daughter. And the second and final story you'll hear is called Take My Soul, and it's about a man who's found on the side of the road, and his discovery leads detectives down a very dark rabbit hole. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the Amazon Music follow button a nice fresh batch of donuts, but instead of filling them with custard, fill them with mayonnaise. Okay, let's get into our first story called The New Nanny. One day in March of 2012, a 5-year-old girl named Maria sat on the floor of her kitchen in a city in northeast Brazil, eating an empada and watching her aunt cook some stew. An empada is very similar to the empanada in that it is a pie filled with meat, but the empada is the Brazilian version of that pie. Maria's family was actually known for their cooking, specifically their empadas. In fact, at this very moment, Maria's mother was out selling their famous empadas on street corners and in bars and local restaurants. Now, the family got by okay this way, but despite their notoriety around these empadas, they really wanted more. They wanted their family name to be respected, to be powerful. And so to try to make that happen, Maria's family basically worked 24/7. Not just on making empadas, but basically in looking for ways to kind of grow and expand the family name. In fact, while Maria was sitting on the kitchen floor, she could hear her father in the other room working. And the reason she knew he was working is because periodically she could hear him yell out with excitement. He was basically sitting there coming up with ideas of how he could make the family name even bigger and better. And when he had a good idea, he would shout out and be like, "Oh, I found it!" And in addition to constantly sort of brainstorming for ideas of how to become rich and powerful, Maria's father also was an author, and he was writing a book that he was convinced was going to be another thing that would kind of ratchet their family up the social hierarchy. But because Maria's mother and father and basically everybody in her family were so completely immersed in work all the time, it meant they didn't really pay much attention to her. And so most of the time, Maria was just kind of on her own, usually playing in the kitchen or playing in the backyard. Just then, the front door opened and in walked Maria's mother, and she was grinning ear to ear. Not only because she now had an empty tray, meaning she had sold all her empadas, but also she had brought someone along that she was really excited to introduce to Maria. Maria's mom stepped all the way into the kitchen, and right behind her was this young woman. And Maria's mother pointed at this young woman and then gestured for Maria to come over and say hi. And she told Maria that this young woman wants to become her new nanny. And so you guys can play together all the time while me and your father are out doing our work. Maria stood up and gave a shy smile to the young woman, but she wasn't sold that this woman actually would become her nanny. Because in the past, there had been other women who had come by to be her nanny, and they didn't seem to last very long. And so Maria was not getting her hopes up.
Still, Maria wanted to be friendly, so she walked over and, as a gesture of goodwill, she handed this woman her half-eaten empada. And the young woman took the empada and laughed and said, "Thank you." After that, Maria's mother told her to head on out back and go play by herself for a bit, while she and this new nanny hammered out the details of her new job. And she told Maria that as soon as they were done, the new nanny would come outside and join her and they could play together. And so Maria, who was always very obedient, did as she was told, and she headed out back and entertained herself. And the whole time, as she's just kicking rocks around and pulling grass up and just kind of doing what kids do, she kept looking back at the house, waiting for the nanny to come outside. But she didn't. And after a whole hour had passed by and still this new nanny had not come outside, Maria felt really bored. And so she went inside to go look for her. A month later, Maria was out in her backyard playing by herself like usual when she heard a commotion happening inside of her house. She looked over at the house and couldn't really tell what was going on, and then she heard the sound of her mother and her father and her aunt raising their voices like they were fighting with somebody, and then all of a sudden, these uniformed police officers came charging out the back door towards Maria. One of the officers came right up to her and asked her what her name was, and Maria was so scared, remember she's 5 years old here, that she didn't even know what to say, so she just stood there staring, being totally terrified. She had no idea what was going on. But, as these police officers would soon tell her, it would turn out her entire life was one big, horrific lie. Maria's father, George Silvera, was not actually her father, nor was Maria's mother, Isabel Silvera, her actual mother, nor was her aunt, Bruna Silva, actually her aunt. In reality, those three people were not related to Maria. They were instead members of a cult called the Cartel Sect. And all these three cult members cared about was impressing the members of the cult. When they thought about, making it big, their so-called family name becoming bigger and more powerful, that was all in relationship to the Cartel Sect. They wanted the members of this cult to look at them as the most powerful and important members of that cult. And the way they tried to do that was by performing the duties of this cult to the best of their abilities, better than anybody else in the cult. And so what did this cartel care about? Well, the literal purpose of the Cartel Sect was to eliminate women they deemed unclean in order to reduce and purify the world's population. And Maria's family, the mother, the father, and the aunt, had become very well versed at doing this. All those nannies that came around to see Maria, well, the reason they kept vanishing is because shortly after the mother, the father, and the aunt introduced them to Maria and said, "Oh, she's going to be your new nanny," they would shoo Maria out into the backyard, and then they would murder the nanny because this person had been deemed unclean. They would cut their throats and stab them to death. But that wasn't all. That wasn't enough cleansing. After they murdered these women, they would then butcher them and stuff the human meat into their famous empadas and sell them to the people in town. They literally were feeding people in the city human meat. But the cult and the cannibalism and the murders were not actually the biggest shock of this story. The biggest shock of the story is actually the real identity of little 5-year-old Maria. She was actually the daughter of the very first victim of the Cartel Sect. The mother, along with Maria 3.5 years earlier, when Maria was just 1.5 years, they had been lured to this very house where her mother was murdered right in front of Maria. And then after her mother was killed, they cooked her mother and fed pieces of the mother to Maria. And ever since, they had just kept Maria and treated her like she was a member of the family, basically turning her into an unwitting cannibal. The existence of the cult and their hideous murders were ultimately discovered after they used one of the credit cards of their victims sometime in the spring of 2012. That's when all the cops rushed into the backyard and confronted Maria. George, Isabel, and Bruna, Maria's fake family, were convicted of 3 murders, including the murder of Maria's real mother, and they are currently serving what amounts to life sentences in Brazil. Police believe the actual number of women that they murdered is as many as 8. As for Maria, according to recent news articles, she was reunited with distant family. Maria is not her real name. That is a pseudonym to protect her identity.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Take My Soul. On the afternoon of July 18, 1997, a man was driving down a road surrounded on both sides by trees in a rural part of Wisconsin called Douglas County. There were no other cars on the road, and so this guy was driving pretty fast. And as he rounded this bend in the road, something out the passenger side window on the side of the road in the grass caught his eye. He couldn't tell what it was, but it was a pretty big object, and after he drove right past it, he just couldn't stop thinking about it. Like, whatever it was, it just seemed out of place. And so for whatever reason, this man felt compelled to actually stop and go see what it was. And so he slowed down and parked on the shoulder, he got out, and began walking along the road back in the direction of this object. And as he got closer, he began to see this object again in the shoulder of the road, and it was sort of obscured by grass and other things, so he couldn't see what it was. But as he got closer, he saw the object was pretty big, and it was all white. And as he took a few more steps and got within maybe 20 or 30 feet, he finally got a better look at this object, and he just froze. Because the object was a man wearing all white, a white suit, a white belt, white shoes, all white, and he was laying on the side of the road, just totally motionless. And for a second, the driver thought, maybe this guy is sleeping, but after taking only a few more steps and getting a totally unobstructed view at this guy, he saw there was a gaping hole in this man's chest. He was obviously dead. And so the driver turned around, ran back to his car, sped to the nearest house, and called 911. The next morning, a Douglas County detective named Stephen Long was sitting at his desk looking at the photos of the dead man in white. This murder case was less than 24 hours old, but already this was one of the weirder cases that this detective had ever been assigned to. The victim had pretty much immediately been identified because he was carrying on his person his wallet, and in his wallet was his driver's license, and so they knew who he was. But the man in white's identity actually made the whole case more confusing, not less. The dead man was a 45-year-old millionaire named Mark Foster. Mark lived 3 hours away in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and had no discernible ties to Douglas County. And so the detective was thinking, what is this rich guy doing here, dressed head to toe, all in white, getting murdered on the side of some local random back road? But things only got more confusing from there. After the medical examiner did Mark's autopsy, he told Detective Long that he had discovered a note inside of Mark's shoe. And the note just said, "Jack Frazier isn't here, but it's Jimmy Bailey, or a lookalike? I hope I'm okay." Now, nobody, including Detective Long, had any idea what this note meant. It was far too cryptic. But when they ran Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey's names through their database, the police discovered that both of those men, one, existed, and two, they lived in Minnesota, same as Mark Foster. And so naturally, Detective Long began to suspect that maybe those two men were connected in some way to Mark Foster. Maybe they were involved in his murder, or maybe they were actually his killer or killers. He didn't know, but it was his best lead. So Detective Long decided he would just have to go to Minneapolis to try to find out more. A few hours later, Detective Long parked his car at the Minneapolis police station. He got out and walked inside the building. Waiting for him inside was the local detective who Mark had already spoken to. And so after meeting this detective, the two of them went into an interview room where Mark Foster's wife was waiting for them. And right away, Detective Long noticed that she was very pregnant and at least 15 or 20 years younger than Mark. But despite that, she seemed very composed. It would turn out she had already been told about her husband's death, and she was basically resigned to the fact that she was here to try to answer questions to figure out what happened. And so the detective sat down and they began to interview her. And then when they brought up the note that was found in Mark's shoe, specifically when they said the two names that were on that note, Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey, when they said that, it triggered something in Mark Foster's wife. She immediately began to cry. And then in between sobs, she would tell the detectives that she knew who those two men were. She told them that she had previously had relationships with both of them before marrying Mark. And she said after she married Mark, Jack and Jimmy became very jealous. They didn't like the idea that she had chosen Mark over them. And so she had always felt like those two, Jack and Jimmy, sort of had it out for Mark as a result of this romantic rivalry. After the interview with Mark's wife ended, Detective Long began to think that, despite this case appearing on the surface to be very odd and confusing, that perhaps in reality, it was quite simple. Maybe Jimmy and Jack were so jealous of Mark that they killed Mark. I mean, based on what Mark's wife had just told them in the interview about them being romantic rivals of Mark, and also the fact that that note was in Mark's shoe and named those two men, it certainly seemed very possible. But over the next couple of days that Detective Long began digging into this theory, that theory fell apart. Because it would turn out Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey had absolutely airtight alibis. They simply couldn't have been the killers. Now, Detective Long was obviously frustrated. He felt like he really had it here, but he was not deterred. He decided his next move would be to try to better understand his victim. To this point, he had already interviewed a lot of Mark's friends and family, but something he had not done yet was simply go to Mark's house and have a look around. So Detective Long got a search warrant, and on July 29th, roughly a week after Mark was killed, Detective Long, along with another detective, pulled up in front of Mark Foster's large two-story home in the middle of a quiet suburban neighborhood. Now, from the outside, the home looked totally ordinary relative to its neighbors. But once they got inside the house, it was anything but. The detectives made their way up to the front door and knocked, and a few seconds later, Mark Foster's wife opened up the door and let them inside. And right away, Detective Long is looking around, and he's seeing all over the walls on the first floor of the house are these graphic pictures and paintings of naked people. And then in addition to that, on some of the coffee tables and various surfaces on the first floor, right when you walk in, are all these pornographic magazines and books everywhere. And Mark's wife didn't acknowledge any of it. She acted like it was completely normal to have all this stuff right in the front part of your house. And so the two detectives are looking at each other as, Mark's wife is leading them on this tour through the first floor. And at some point, Detective Long just said, "Hey, Mrs. Foster, why don't you have a seat on the couch and you just let us take a look around your house on our own?" And so she said, okay. She sat down on the couch, and then the two detectives, they left the living room, went back to the front of the house, and made their way upstairs. And once they got upstairs, they found the master suite, and there was all this bondage gear inside. There were leather straps attached to the bedposts, there was whips and handcuffs, there was also additional pornographic material in there. But, considering what the detectives had seen downstairs, this sort of felt on par for this house. And so after searching the other bedrooms and other rooms on the second floor and finding more pornographic material basically everywhere, the detectives found their way back to the hallway in the second floor, and they noticed there was a rope hanging down from the ceiling, and it was attached to the pull door that led to the attic. And so the two detectives, they walked over, they pulled the rope down, it revealed this fold-out set of stairs that came down from the attic, and once those were in place, the two detectives began climbing up. And once they got up there, they discovered that this attic was not a storage space like many attics are in American homes. Instead, this attic was a fully functional room that sort of resembled like a satanic dungeon of sorts. All the walls were totally jet black, and there were all these burned out candles all over the place and tarot cards littering the floor. And on the back of the attic, basically all the way on the other side, there was what appeared to be an altar that sort of overlooked the entire room. And on the altar were more candles, and there was a voodoo doll. It's totally creepy, and the two detectives are looking at each other like, what's going on here? And so the detectives, they climbed all the way into the attic, and then slowly began walking across towards the altar. And when they got close enough to actually see the altar up close, they just froze. Because sitting on the altar, in addition to the candles and the voodoo doll, were two business cards. Their own business cards. Detective Long and his partner immediately went downstairs and confronted Mark's wife about the attic. Like, what's going on up there? Why are our business cards on your altar? But Mark's wife, the second that attic was mentioned, went silent. She refused to speak about anything to do with the attic. And so after a minute, realizing this conversation was going nowhere, Detective Long and his partner called for backup. And as they waited for backup, the two of them stepped away from Mark's wife and began speculating like, is this a cult? Was Mark a part of a cult that ran it out of his attic? Like, what's going on here? And are we being targeted by the cult? Is that why our names are on the altar? A few minutes later, backup arrived, and they would do a much more extensive search of the property. But other than finding more pornographic materials and, bondage gear, there really wasn't anything else substantive that connected Mark or his wife to what happened to Mark, or what Mark was even doing in this house. Was he in a cult? They didn't know. And so ultimately, Detective Long and his partner told Mark's wife, who still is being quiet at this point, that she should not leave town because they were going to follow up with her soon. Now, in fairness, Detective Long couldn't tell if Mark's wife was being silent and not talking about what was going on in her house because, she was complicit in some way in what happened to Mark, or if she was maybe being threatened by somebody and she was afraid to talk. They didn't know. But either way, after leaving the property after the search was over, Detective Long and his partner felt like their next move was to try to learn more about cults. They needed a cult expert. And it just so happened there was an occult bookstore very close to Mark's house. And so they decided they would start there. And right away, their decision to go to that bookstore paid dividends, but not how the detectives expected. It would turn out the owner of that bookstore was indeed a cult expert. But much more importantly, and relevant to this case, was that the owner happened to personally know Mark Foster. And he told the detectives that Mark came to his bookstore all the time, and also the owner said he knew a bunch of Mark's friends. And so by the time the detectives left the bookstore, they had learned a little bit about cults, but more importantly, they left with a list of names the owner had given them of known associates of Mark Foster who maybe were involved in whatever was going on in Mark's house, and so maybe they had information about what happened to Mark. The detectives were able to track down everybody on this list very quickly, and they were all young people in their 20s. And in each of the interviews they conducted, each of these young people were very open about being in what they called a religious group that they said Mark was a part of as well. Now, the detectives theorized that this religious group was very likely a cult, like they believed, but they didn't call it a cult. They called it a group. But the detectives didn't let up. They kept pressing these people until eventually a new name surfaced, Greg Freisner. Now, none of these people said Greg was in charge of the cult. Instead, they just sort of said, well, talk to Greg if you want more information about our group. The detectives naturally began to wonder if this Greg person was the cult leader, or maybe he was Mark's killer, or maybe he was both. But regardless, it seemed pretty apparent that they needed to talk to Greg because he might have more information about what happened to Mark. It took a few days, but the detectives were able to track Greg down, and they brought him in for an interview. And boy, oh boy, did Greg have a story to tell. Based on what Greg told the detectives, here is what happened to Mark on the day that he died, on July 18th, 1997. On that day, Greg Freisner met Mark Foster at Mark's home. And when Mark came outside, he was dressed head to toe in white, something he would do for special ceremonies. And so Mark, he came down the steps, didn't say a word to Greg. They went to Greg's car. Greg hopped in the driver's seat, and Mark climbed into the back seat. And before long, they took off and began driving northeast. And for hours, these two just drove in total silence. Mark just stared out the window, and Greg focused on driving. The only thing that happened during this multi-hour-long drive was at some point Mark pulled out a piece of paper from his coat pocket, and he wrote something on it, and then after staring at it, he kind of smiled and tucked it into his shoe. And then a little bit later, Greg pulled over on the side of the road in Douglas County, Wisconsin, on this random backcountry road. And as soon as they pulled over, again without saying anything, Greg and Mark got out of the car, and they went around to the back of the car where the trunk was. And the two men are kind of stretching, it's been a long drive, taking in the scenery, and then before long, Greg pops open the trunk. And in the trunk is a rifle. Neither man have any strong reaction to this. Greg just reaches down, pulls the rifle out, and Mark, calm as can be, just begins walking over to the side of the road, to the shoulder. And then once he got to the shoulder, Greg came over and stood right in front of him and just looked intently into Mark's eyes, looking for the signal. And at some point, after Mark kind of composed himself, he nodded at Greg. At which point Greg raised that rifle, placed the barrel directly on Mark's chest, and fired. Mark crumpled to the ground, and he laid there for a second just moaning horribly, and Greg just stood over him watching until finally Mark went silent and died, at which point Greg casually went back to his car, got inside, and drove home. The only time he stopped was to throw his rifle into a nearby river.
But once Greg got home, he was overjoyed because he knew the sacred ritual he had just carried out with Mark had been a total success. It had gone exactly to plan. It would turn out Mark Foster was absolutely a member of that religious group, the cult, if you will. Except he was not just a member. He was the cult's leader. And Mark is the one who orchestrated his own death. However, Mark did not view his death as him actually dying. Quite the opposite.
We celebrate life as we celebrate death. Death is nothing to be afraid of. Death is a great crossroads, a change in attitude, a change in longitude, a change in the way that we perceive our spirit. When we reach that portal, they'll ring some golden bells.
He believed that what he and Greg, his most devout follower, were going to do, this sacred ritual, was after Greg fires the shot into his chest and ends this body's life, that his soul, his consciousness, and his power will be transferred into Greg. Basically, his soul will go into Greg. And Mark believed once this transfer happened, that basically he would be immortal, that his soul would never die. It would stay in Greg and then maybe at some point get transferred to somebody else, but basically he would be here forever. The bizarre note that was found in Mark's shoe, the note that he wrote and stuffed in there, that note was designed to throw police off the trail. He knew that he was having Greg murder him, again for this ritual, but he wanted to make sure Greg didn't get caught. And so he wrote on the note very specifically Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey. Those two people he hated. He hated that they had been in past relationships with his wife, and they hated him, and so he figured if he was going to create a scapegoat for his murder, who better than his romantic rivals? They had nothing to do with it. He just named them in that cryptic note to get them in trouble. As for all the pornography and bondage gear that was found inside of Mark's home, well, that all played a role in Mark's cult as well. He was a firm believer that the more sex he had with his followers, often multiple followers at the same time, the more powerful he would become. As for the detective's business cards found on the altar up in the attic, those were very likely placed there by followers of Mark, so members of the cult, in an effort to potentially, thwart their efforts to solve the case. They might have believed that by placing those on there and performing various rituals, that somehow would prevent them from solving the case. We don't know for sure. That's the theory around why they were there, but obviously that didn't work. Greg Freisner would ultimately be found guilty for playing a role in Mark's death. He obviously was the triggerman, and so he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. As for Mark's wife, although she definitely knew about the cult and may have been a participant, there was never any evidence that actually connected her to Mark's murder, and so she was never charged with any crime. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the MrBallen podcast, as well as Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature two stories about people who had sinister intentions. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Lawana the Bloodthirster, and it's about a horrifying ritual that led to a supposed curse. And the second and final story you'll hear is called The Witching Hour, and it's about a group of people in Illinois who kill on demand. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday.
So, if that's of interest to you, when the Amazon Music follow button has just finished raking up all of their fallen leaves in their yard, break out your leaf blower and obliterate all of their piles. Okay, let's get into our first story called Lawana the Bloodthirster. In 1909, Lawana Constantinescu was a 27-year-old woman living in the Romanian city of Timișoara. Lawana was a devout practitioner of Zoroastrianism, which is one of the world's oldest organized religions that began in ancient Persia and is now practiced primarily in East Asia. In the city that Lawana was living in, it was majority Christian, and they looked at Zoroastrians as witches. As such, Lawana was persecuted and ostracized primarily by these two Christian ministers that spread a rumor that she was drinking the blood of local children and that she worshipped Satan. That rumor would spread and grow to the point where everybody knew Lawana as like the singular witch of all the Zoroastrians in the city, and it ultimately incited this angry Christian mob to storm her house on October 21st, 1909, and rip her into the streets and savagely beat her to within an inch of her life. She would survive this lynching, and she would be taken to a hospital where she'd be treated for severe blunt force injuries and lacerations. But after 2 days of being in the hospital, when she had not made a full recovery at all, she checked herself out and headed home. The next day, Lawana was found dead in her apartment, and her family and friends initially believed that she had died as a result of the injuries she had sustained from the angry mob, and that perhaps she had checked herself out of the hospital too soon, and untreated, that's why she must have passed away early. But when the authorities arrived at her house and began looking at the scene, it did not look like she had died as a result of those injuries. It looked more like some sort of ritual suicide. She was laying on this sofa with her arms over her chest. Next to the sofa was an altar that was adorned with strange occult symbols and ritual herbs and effigies, and on the altar was this goblet with deep, dark red stains on the inside. When they looked at Lawana, even though she was fully dressed, underneath her sleeves were all these cuts on her arms, and there were cuts on her legs as well. After her autopsy, the medical examiner said she had died from a combination of blood loss and internal shock from ingesting massive quantities of blood that triggered cardiac arrest. Lawana had been draining her own blood into the sacramental goblet, drinking it, and then doing it over and over again until she died. Locals believed that that was not just a ritual suicide, but rather she was placing a curse on her enemies. Almost immediately following her death, those two Christian ministers that had spread those rumors about her that led to the mob coming and attacking her, they both died of an extremely rare blood-borne illness. And then immediately following their demise, the two primary vigilantes that actually organized that mob that would attack Lawana, they both died. One was hit by a falling tree and another died in a fire. And according to more recent accounts, Lawana's curse didn't end with the death of her tormentors. There have been dozens of reports of people after seeing an image, which is of Lawana after she was discovered by authorities in her home, that they will have bouts of extreme sleep paralysis. These are people that have never had sleep paralysis before, that this picture somehow induces sleep paralysis in them, like they're cursed by Lawana. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Witching Hour. Just before midnight on August 22nd, 2005, 38-year-old Rick Eck knocked on the front door of an apartment in the tiny Midwestern farm town of Claremont, Illinois. As Rick waited for the door to open, he could barely stand still because he was so excited about what he was going to be doing that night. Finally, the door swung open, and Rick saw right in front of him this very skinny and gaunt-looking woman with dark hair and dark eyes staring back at him. Her name was Irenia Kottner, and she was 34 years old, and by day, she worked at Walmart, but at night, she became the real version of herself. She was a witch who actually led a group of witches known as a coven that Rick was a part of. Without saying anything, Irenia motioned for Rick to follow her into her apartment, and then Irenia turned and began walking away. And Rick, before stepping over the threshold, he paused for a moment and just turned to the guy he had brought with him, a tall, muscular man named David Lindner, and Rick, he just kind of nodded at David, and David nodded back, and then the two of them walked inside. As Rick and David followed Irenia into her apartment, Rick still could barely contain his excitement. He had only joined this coven recently, about a year and a half ago, and so witchcraft, which is something they were going to be doing that night, was kind of new to him, but it was very exciting. Rick had been inspired to become a witch and join this coven after watching the Harry Potter movies, and so he was hopeful that tonight would go something like Harry Potter. And Rick knew David, the guy he had brought along, was this very powerful warlock, which is a male witch, and so he figured, if David's here, this is bound to go to plan. Rick just hoped he'd be able to keep up with David, or at least play some sort of meaningful support role. Irenia eventually led Rick and David down this dark hallway to this small living room where in the middle of the floor was a ring of lit candles. And as soon as Rick and David stepped into the room with Irenia, they were hit with this powerful smell of incense that had been burning in the room, and also there was all this smoke hovering in the air from the various things that Irenia had been burning in preparation for tonight's event. Rick, David, and Irenia walked quietly into the middle of this circle of candles, and they sat down cross-legged in a circle facing each other, and then they got ready to begin. Life in the town of Claremont was normally very quiet and peaceful. This is a town that literally has more cornfields than people, and Claremont was over 100 miles away from the nearest city. But beneath the calm exterior, Claremont had a dark side. Amongst the 200 or so residents of Claremont were several very dark witches. Not this coven, not Irenia, Rick, and David. They were the good guys. The dark witches, they were kind of out and about in this town and doing bad things like practicing evil magic and evil witchcraft. And so this coven, led by Irenia, was actually in place to try to combat these evil witches in their midst. And tonight, Rick, David, and Irenia were going to attempt to perform their most ambitious and important magic yet. The coven was going to attempt to break a powerful hex, which is kind of like a curse. And this hex was cast by a person who might very well be the worst of all the dark witches in Claremont, a 16-year-old girl named Lindsay Cassinger. As Rick sat cross-legged in the middle of the circle, he found himself staring at the two slightly bigger candles that sat in the dead center of the circle, that were basically right between Rick, David, and Irenia. And David, as he stared at these two candles, he saw etched in each of the candles' bodies were words. On one candle it said Lindsay, and on the other candle it was etched baby. Because it would turn out this very evil dark witch, Lindsay, was pregnant, and so instead of having to combat one dark soul, the coven would have to combat two, because Lindsay and her baby were kind of intertwined. Now, before this night, the coven had attempted several times to try to break this hex that Lindsay had cast, and the coven believed initially this hex was actually cast directly at Irenia, because Irenia was suffering from things like depression and anxiety and not finding love, and so of course that had to be a product of this curse. And as the coven had continued to try and fail at breaking this hex, the hex had only become more powerful and begun to spread, from Irenia to other witches in this coven who actually were not present this particular night, including a 20-year-old woman who began complaining of depression and ever-worsening headaches, which of course had to be because of this hex. And so that was why, on this night, the coven had decided to really beef up their attack on this hex, and so that was why Rick had gone out and brought in David, the experienced warlock from St. Louis, Missouri, who claimed he had broken a hex before, and he could do it again for them. As Rick, Irenia, and Dave all sat in the circle, They looked at each other, and then they began chanting in unison to bring out the dead, to join them in the living room right now. And as they began this chant, Rick found himself intensely staring at those two candles with Lindsay and Baby on them, and as he stared at the flames dancing across the top of them, Rick started to feel like he was kind of drifting off into a trance-like state. And he knew that based on his prior teachings from Irenia, the leader of this coven, that this must be what it feels like when the spirit world opens up, which means the dead really were coming into the room. And then, as Rick is kind of dealing with this trance-like state, he heard Irenia begin to talk, but it wasn't her normal voice. It was the slow and deep-sounding voice, almost like something had inhabited her body and taken it over and was now speaking through her mouth. And Irenia, in this kind of slow and strange voice, she would tell Rick and David that the curse is still growing. And then she would say something that totally caught Rick by surprise. She said, again in that slow, strange voice, that the hex now was also on Rick and his entire family, and if they didn't break this hex immediately, Rick and his family would all perish. And when Rick heard this, he's still in this trance-like state, but his heart began racing because he didn't know this hex could potentially affect his loved ones, and so this was a really big deal. They needed to end this hex tonight. Rick listened intently as Irenia began to say in this strange voice what their plan was for that night to break this hex. Basically, Rick and David were going to perform a sacred ritual, and Irenia, she began to say to the spirits in the room that Rick and David, they were ready, but they needed help. And so after she said this, she went quiet, and so too did Rick and David, and they're all just sitting there kind of waiting for something to happen. And then after about a minute of just total silence, Irenia began to speak again, still in this strange, slow, bizarre voice, but Rick and David knew now it was a different voice coming out of her. Now Irenia was speaking on behalf of the spirit world that was in the room with them. And Irenia, she would say in this voice, "I grant you 5 demons to help you on your quest to break this hex." And then after saying this, Irenia, she opened her eyes and she looked kind of confused for a moment, and then she kind of got her bearings. And she looked at David and Rick and she told them now in her normal voice that they had to perform this sacred ritual before the 2 candles in the middle with Lindsay and Baby etched on them burned out. And so basically, Rick and David, they needed to get this done tonight. Then Irenia handed David a sacred tool that would be used that night in this sacred ritual that David and Rick were going to complete. And then Rick and David, they would stand up to leave, and before they left, Irenia would give them the typical witch send-off, which was, "Blessed be." And then Rick and David, they nodded their heads, they turned and walked out of the apartment, and as soon as they were out into the night, Rick could have sworn he saw dark shadows moving around all over the place, and he knew right then and there that he and David would be safe that night, because clearly the shadows moving around had to be those 5 demons that Irenia had called forth from the spirit world to protect them this night. And so feeling very safe and empowered, Rick and David went straight into Rick's car. Rick turned it on and pulled away from the curb and began heading towards their destination. A few miles away, at the house where the 16-year-old evil witch, Lindsay Cassinger, lived, a 20-year-old Army private named Joshua Bennett was sitting at the kitchen table in Lindsay's house, eating chicken wings and just kind of enjoying his night. Josh didn't know Lindsay very well, but he wasn't at her house to see Lindsay. He was at her house to see his own mother. And Josh and his mother had a lot of catching up to do. She had abandoned him and his father when he was young, and so Josh's dad had raised him, and then when Josh was old enough, he had joined the military, and now he was about to deploy to the Middle East to go to war. But unexpectedly, Josh's father had died, and so Josh had come back to Illinois for the funeral, and it was at the funeral where he saw his mother. She was in attendance as well, and, even though he was upset with his mother for abandoning him, he felt like, I want to reconnect with her. And so he'd gone over and he'd given her a hug, and his mother had been so touched that she had asked Josh to come by her house in Claremont, Illinois, where she lived with her boyfriend, because she really wanted some alone time to actually hear about Josh's life and kind of, get back together again. And so, of course, Josh had said yes, and so here he was at this house in Claremont. Now, Josh had arrived at this house a little bit earlier, and he was surprised to discover that it was not just his mother and her boyfriend living there, but also his mother's boyfriend's son, whose name was Jackie, was also living there, along with his pregnant girlfriend, the evil witch, Lindsay Cassinger. But Josh didn't really mind that there was extra people. It was just maybe a little bit confusing that this was kind of a big roommate situation. But it seemed like Jackie and his girlfriend Lindsay were very nice people, and they quickly went downstairs to the apartment in the basement and kind of just stayed out of the way so Josh and his mother could catch up. And so after Josh finished eating his wings, his mother came into the kitchen, and the two of them chatted for hours, and then finally, at about midnight that night, Josh decided to go to bed, so he said goodnight to his mom, he retreated to the bedroom, and he laid in bed. But he couldn't really sleep right away because he had a lot going on in his life. I mean, he had just lost his dad a couple of weeks ago, and then at the same time, he had reconnected with his estranged mother, and he's about to deploy to Iraq, to a war zone, and, he felt ready for that, but at the same time, he was kind of apprehensive, it's about to happen, I hope I'll be able to do my job. And so with all these kind of intense thoughts swirling around his head, he just kind of laid there and didn't really expect to sleep anytime soon. But eventually, Josh did fall asleep. However, it felt like he had only been asleep for a couple of minutes when he was abruptly woken up by the sound of barking coming out from the kitchen. Jackie's dog was going crazy. And so Josh grabbed his phone and he checked the time and saw it was 3 a.m. And so instead of going out there and dealing with this dog, he just thought, you know what, it's going to stop eventually. And so Josh grabbed his pillow and he put it over his head and tried to muffle the sounds so he could fall back asleep. But it didn't work. The dog just kept on barking. And then when Josh took the pillow off his head and kind of sat up wondering what he should do about this dog situation, he heard the sound of a man's voice, a stranger's voice, saying, "I bring you forth from the dark." And then after Josh heard this, he heard the sound of a woman screaming, and it sounded like his mom. And so acting on instinct, Josh leapt from his bed, he ran out of the room, and he goes into the kitchen, and he sees the dog is jumping and barking and going mad, and his mom is screaming, and there's this guy grabbing her, kind of grappling with her, who's wearing black gloves and a ski mask, and there's another guy next to him with the same getup. It's absolute chaos. But before Josh could run over and save his mother, suddenly his chest felt like it was on fire, and then he went blind, and his eyes had this burning pain in them, and then he couldn't breathe, and he was stumbling backwards, barely able to stand. Minutes later, Rick, who was one of the witches from the coven, bolted out of the front door of Lindsay's house where all this chaos was happening, and he just took off running across the street directly into a cornfield. And as he ran, he felt this throbbing pain in his leg, and he could feel blood pooling in his shoe. Rick ran until he couldn't run any farther, and then he collapsed onto the ground, and then he began thinking about what an absolute disaster it had been inside of the evil witch's house. Not only had they failed to break the hex cast by Lindsay, but also Rick was concerned that David, his partner, who was still at the house, was dead. And Rick, he began looking around wildly, hoping all those demons that were sent to help them from the spirit world, he was hoping they'd be nearby and they'd know what to do. But Rick looked around and there was no one. So Rick thought for a second, oh my gosh, Lindsay's hex must be stronger than any of us realize. We have to do something now. We have to end this before me and my family get killed too. And so Rick pulled out his phone and he called Irenia, the leader of the coven, to get her advice about what they should do next. But Irenia didn't respond to what Rick was saying the way he expected her to. Instead, she seemed very cold and almost enraged at what he was saying. And then before Rick could kind of figure out what was going on with Irenia, he heard off in the distance the sound of sirens making their way to the evil witch's house. Over the next few days, police detectives would speak to everyone inside of Irenia's coven, as well as everyone who knew both Irenia and Lindsay. And slowly but surely, the police would put together what actually happened inside of Lindsay, the evil witch's house, in the early morning hours of August 23rd, 2005. At about 3 a.m. on August 23rd, 2005, Rick and David pulled up onto Lindsay's street and they parked their car a little ways away from Lindsay's house. And then after parking, Rick and David donned their ski masks and their gloves. And then after looking at each other and nodding, they hopped out and began walking towards Lindsay's house. Their plan was to sneak in through one of Lindsay's windows and confront Lindsay the evil witch directly and break the hex by performing a sacred ritual. And then after this ritual was over, they had a second ritual they would need to perform that would send Lindsay's evil soul through the gates of hell. And to do that, they needed the help of the 5 demons that had been sent along by Irenia from the spirit world. Now, Rick and David felt like this was a great plan. However, as soon as they got to Lindsay's house and David actually began trying to climb into one of the windows, everything fell apart. First, the dog began to bark inside of Lindsay's house, and that alerted Josh's mother, who came into the kitchen and sees the dog and sees David falling through the window. And Rick, who didn't really know what was happening inside the house, he just climbed through the window after David, and when he stood up in the kitchen, he realized it was too late. They were totally caught. And so Rick, not really knowing what to do, he's seeing all this yelling and chaos happening. He looks over at David, and he sees David grab something from his belt, and he pulls it out. And it was the tool that Irenia had given them when they left her apartment to go carry out this sacred ritual. This tool was part of that sacred ritual, and it was a long, sharp knife. And what they were going to do is stab the evil witch, Lindsay Kassinger, to death with it. That was how they were going to break the hex. And then after they killed Lindsay, they were going to perform this weird ritual with her clothing that would send her soul through the gates of hell. Now, Rick did understand that this was the plan. They were going to murder Lindsay, but perhaps he didn't really know how serious David was about carrying it out, or the fact that David was not really a warlock as much as he was a violent criminal who had bragged to Irenia about previously murdering someone who had cast a separate hex. And so by killing this person, that was how David had broken the hex previously. Also, Rick may not have known that David had been instructed by Irenia to not let anything stand in their way to break this hex, to carry out this sacred ritual on Lindsay. And so Rick just watched as David raised the knife and began stabbing Josh's mother over and over again in the chest while screaming, "I bring you forth from the dark." And it was at this point that Josh, the army private who heard all this happening, came charging out in his underwear into the kitchen, and Rick watched as David went from stabbing Josh's mother to turning and immediately stabbing Josh directly in the chest. And Rick, at this point, he just jumped right in on it and pulled out his pepper spray and sprayed Josh in the eyes. And so that was why Josh felt the burning sensation and then went blind and couldn't breathe and fell to the ground. And so now it is absolutely chaos inside of this kitchen, and the actual target of David and Rick's, Lindsay, the evil witch, she managed to run out of the house and run to a nearby neighbor's house to get help. Meanwhile, the evil witch's boyfriend, Jackie, he comes upstairs carrying a shotgun. And at this point, Josh is on the ground, clearly dying from the stab wound to his chest. His mother as well is struggling on the ground. And David is going totally nuts, saying all these strange things and whipping his knife around. And Rick is just totally panicking and doesn't know what to do. And so when Jackie ran at Rick with this shotgun, Rick pulled out his own knife and attempted to stab Jackie, but somehow missed Jackie and stabbed himself in the leg. And so that was why his leg was throbbing and bleeding, because he had stabbed himself. And then after Rick had stabbed himself, Jackie just walked over and Spartan kicked Rick down the stairs into the basement. And then Jackie turned his attention from Rick to David, who was still just going nuts with this knife and being a total maniac. And Jackie just walked over to David, and David, he sees the shotgun coming over to him, and he tries to move the barrel out of the way, but then somehow only manages to point the gun directly at his own stomach, at which point Jackie just fired a slug directly into David's gut. And it was at this moment, as David is crumpling to the ground with this horrible stomach wound, that the neighbor that Lindsay, the evil witch, had gone to go get, had come to the house. They went inside, and they found a scene of absolute carnage. And before the neighbor could even do anything, Rick, who had stabbed himself in the leg and been kicked down into the basement, had scrambled up the steps and just run right past all the bodies on the ground, past the neighbor who didn't even do anything, outside, and Rick just kept on running out into that cornfield. And so at this point, the neighbor didn't even try to figure out what happened. He just called 911. But it was already too late for Josh, the army private, who was only at this house to reconnect with his estranged mother before he deployed to Iraq. And here he was, dead on the ground from this totally bizarre attack. It would turn out Rick, David, and really the entire coven of witches that fell under Irenia had been totally duped. They all fully believed that Lindsay was in fact an evil witch who had cast this hex on Irenia, which was spreading to all the other members of the coven. But in reality, Irenia, the leader of this coven, she didn't believe there was a hex. That had nothing to do with any of this. The whole coven thing was totally made up. She was just jealous that Lindsay was dating Jackie. Irenia had previously dated Jackie and they had broken up, and Irenia still wanted to get back together, but Jackie didn't. And so now that Jackie was with Lindsay, Irenia just couldn't handle it. And so, naturally, Irenia had constructed this whole thing about Lindsay being one of the dark witches in Claremont, Illinois, and she's cast this hex, and now you, my witches in this coven, you need to go and kill her. But, of course, Lindsay did not end up getting killed, and instead, it was the totally innocent person, Josh, the army private, who had nothing to do with any of this, who got killed. In addition to Josh dying, David, the warlock from St. Louis, he died from the shotgun blast to his stomach, and then Josh's mother, who had been stabbed repeatedly by David, she would actually survive her attack. Irenia would ultimately be found guilty of first-degree murder, and she would be sentenced to 57 years in prison. Rick pleaded guilty to murder as well, and he was sentenced to 20 years, and a third member of the coven, who was not present for the attack, but who after the fact helped cover it up, they were sentenced to 32 years in prison.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the MrBallen podcast, and also Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 3 stories about acts so strange and unsettling, they blur the line between devotion and madness. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Exit Interviews, and it's about one of the most infamous cult cases in history. The second story you'll hear is called A Family Ritual, and it's about a sickening act a family performs together. Keep in mind, for this story, listener discretion is advised. And the third and final story you'll hear is called The Helping Hand. And in this story, a literal hand washes up on a beach in Florida, after which a very mysterious case begins to unravel. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload 4 times a week: Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Fridays. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the like button a nice peanut butter and jelly sandwich. But make sure you employ a 6-to-1 peanut butter to jelly ratio. Okay, let's get into our first story called Exit Interviews.
In the early 1970s, a man named Marshall Applewhite was fired from his music teaching job for having an inappropriate relationship with a male student. Shortly after, he admitted himself into a psychiatric institution where he met a nurse who worked there named Bonnie Nettles. Both had a deep interest in biblical prophecy, and Applewhite, after meeting Nettles, was convinced they had met in a previous life. Nettles agreed and took it a step further, saying extraterrestrials had come to her and preordained that she would someday meet Applewhite. The two did not have a romantic relationship at all. It was strictly platonic. They bonded over a desire to ascend to a higher level of existence and ultimately reach the kingdom of heaven. Applewhite began calling himself Bo, and Nettles became Peep, and together they would start an infamous cult known as Heaven's Gate. The premise of Heaven's Gate was that an alien spacecraft that they simply called the UFO was going to come to Earth and whisk away Heaven's Gate cult members, elevating them to a new world and a better life that they referred to as Tela, or the evolutionary level above human. There was a catch though. Anybody on Earth who did not get on the UFO whenever it got here would be recycled, i.e. destroyed, along with everybody else on Earth, and then at some point a new human population would grow, and another UFO would come, and whoever got on that would be saved over and over and over again. That was just how it worked. And Bo and Peep were telling everyone they talked to about Heaven's Gate that we're already in end times. Apparently there were signs that this UFO is going to be here any day, and so now is the time to join the cult. And so by 1975, Bo and Peep had recruited 20 people to be a part of their cult, which meant they gave up their families, they gave up their possessions, they basically gave up everything in their life and moved to Colorado to live in total poverty as they waited for this UFO to arrive. For 10 years, cult members waited and waited for this UFO that never showed up. And Bo and Peep are aggressively reminding people that this is the path, you just gotta stay the path. And then Peep unexpectedly died of cancer in 1985, which really screwed things up for the cult. In their doctrine, it was destiny that Bo and Peep would get on that UFO and make their way to Tela, the evolutionary level above human. That was their destiny. And now Peep has died on planet Earth. She did not get on the UFO. She did not ascend to Tela. She will not get to Heaven's Gate. Bo was devastated and horribly depressed, and it wasn't really clear what was going to happen to Heaven's Gate. But he composed himself and he began to tweak his messaging a little bit. Bo began telling his followers that Peep had in fact ascended to Tela. Yes, she did not get on the UFO. However, the aliens must have given her a signal that if she leaves behind this human body, this mere vessel, you'll still ascend to Tela. Basically, he was preaching to them, if you just end your own life at the right moment, you can go to Tela too. But Bo didn't really know what the right moment was. He didn't know what the trigger was going to be. Until 1995, when astronomers discovered the Hale-Bopp comet was going to be passing by Earth 2 years later in 1997. And Bo saw this as the trigger. The UFO was going to be hiding behind the trail of this comet, and for sure, Peep was riding on that UFO, and as soon as it passes by Earth, we need to ascend. And so fast forward to March 26, 1997, as the Hale-Bopp comet passed by Earth, 39 of the Heaven's Gate cult members, including Bo, they began their journey. Bo told them they would be exiting the Earth in 3 groups. And so on March 26th, Group 1 entered their San Diego mansion and consumed applesauce mixed with barbiturates, followed it up with a whole bunch of vodka, and then put a bag over their head and waited for death. Then on March 27th, Group 2 entered the San Diego mansion, knowing full well what they were walking into. They all had specific jobs of how they were going to clean up the mess left from Group 1. They cleaned it up. Then they picked up the Group 1 members and placed them in beds and put a purple cloth over their face before they, Group 2, consumed their own applesauce mixed with barbiturates and put a bag over their head and waited for death. On March 28th, the 3rd group entered the San Diego mansion, and this included Bo, and they did the same cleanup as Group 2. They put the Group 2 deceased members in bed as well, and then they consumed applesauce and barbiturates, followed it up with vodka, bag over their head, waited for death. Bo had given special instructions to 2 of the members that were within that third group to wait until he had exited Earth and take special care to put him in a specific bed, organized a certain way, and then when they consumed their own applesauce and barbiturates followed up with vodka, they should do that in their bed because they're the last 2. There's nobody else to move them. When a former cult member stopped by the San Diego mansion to check in on the cult, they went inside not knowing what they were up to and found all 39 cult members deceased, laying in bunk beds with identical black and white Nike running shoes on their feet with purple shrouds over their bodies, and they were all wearing matching armbands that read Heaven's Gate Away Team. Just hours before they exited the Earth, each of the groups would perform exit interviews where they would record themselves talking about why they were doing this, why it was important, and what they expected on the other side. They are remarkably cheerful and happy considering what they all know they are about to do. Here are some highlights from those exit interviews.
Okay, we have Thirsody with us, and I believe that you chose the name Thirsody because you want to be reminded of your thirst for next level knowledge. Is that correct?
That's right. I know my vehicle's, or this vehicle that I'm wearing is, pretty nervous, pretty scared. Some may say, well, boy, it's quite a irreversible step.
This isn't a troubling circumstance. Don't take it as that. It's just a gateway, just a doorway.
Okay, thank you.
Now you're going to find this old crummy vehicle in a bunk someplace that I'll probably be watching when you check it out and observe your responses and your reaction when you look at these vehicles. And they're all nothing but containers that we've used and borrowed for the short amount of time.
People in the world who thought that I had completely lost my marbles. They're not right.
Our next story is called A Family Ritual. On April 9th, 2005, in Kaohsiung City, Taiwan, a young man was home alone inside of his apartment watching TV. And as he sat there watching TV, he heard a loud thumping sound coming from right above him. As soon as he heard it, he muted his TV and he listened for a second, and a minute later, he heard it again, a loud thump. And then he heard another one, and another one, and another one, and before long, all he heard was a succession of thumps and also what sounded like chanting coming from upstairs. However, as unusual as these types of sounds might be to the average person, to this young man, these actually weren't that weird. Because the family that lived right above him, the Wu family, were pretty eccentric. They were very religious people who often did these ceremonial dances and rituals at all hours, and a lot of times they involved stomping around and chanting really loudly. And as annoying as that could be, this young man never complained. He was very respectful of the Wu family, and he knew, these sounds he was hearing were connected to their religion, and he felt like that was none of his business. And so, like he did basically every other time he would hear these noises, he simply turned the volume up on his TV and tried to forget about them. But after a few minutes, it was like the noises coming from upstairs just kept getting louder and louder and louder until it was basically impossible to ignore. And then suddenly he heard a scream coming from upstairs that certainly did not feel attached to a ceremony. It sounded like somebody was in danger or in trouble or something. And so at that point, the young man turned the TV off and he stood up and he thought, I need to go up there and make sure things are okay. I mean, forget being annoyed. It sounds like, someone's in trouble or someone's hurt or something. But as he began making his way towards his door to go upstairs and check on the Wu family, all the noises just completely stopped and it was silent upstairs. And at that point, the young man just stopped where he was. And for a minute, he just listened, waiting to see if maybe the noises would pick back up again. But they didn't. And so the young man just turned around, walked back to his seat, and turned the TV back on. 2 days later, on April 11th, that same young man was back home all alone, watching TV yet again, when, once again, he heard a loud pounding sound. Except this time, it was not coming from upstairs, it was coming from his front door. Somebody was hammering on his front door trying to get his attention. And so the young man turned off the TV, he got up, and he went over to his door, he opened it up, and standing there on the landing was this middle-aged man named Wu Shan, who was the patriarch of the Wu family upstairs. And Wu Shan looked absolutely horrible. He was dressed all in black head to toe, but he was pale and skinny and very gaunt, and he was covered in what looked like filth, like food and ash, and he smelled unbelievably horrible. And the young man, he asked Wu Shan, like, hey, is everything okay? And remember, the young man's thinking about that crazy, loud ceremony they had just 2 days earlier, wondering, whatever happened with that. That was so loud. But Wu Shan just looked back at the young man with this kind of vacant expression, and he just said, call an ambulance. And then, without saying anything else, Wu Shan turned, ran down the steps, and disappeared out into the street. And so at this point, the young man is left just standing there having no idea what to think. I mean, Wu Shan did not look well, and he's now run away. And again, this young man is thinking about that bizarre ritual he overheard a couple of days ago that just kind of stopped abruptly after screams were heard. Now he's being told to call an ambulance, and so he's thinking, I better go upstairs and make sure things are okay before I do anything else. And so the young man left his apartment, went upstairs to the Wu family's apartment, and the door was shut. But even standing outside the door, he began to smell that same absolutely horrible smell that he smelled on Wu Shan. So he knocks on the Wu family's door, he's kind of covering his nose, but he doesn't get a response, nobody comes to the door. And so after looking around, he just tried the doorknob and he found it was unlocked. So, pretty apprehensively, but knowing he needed to see what was going on here, he opened up the door and right away he's hit with another wave of just this disgusting smell. He can barely breathe. But nonetheless, he steps into the house and he calls out to anybody, anyone come over here and tell me what's going on. But nobody called back. And he kind of looked around the family's apartment and it was totally filthy. There was just this grime all over everything. And he made his way all the way into the living room. And there he stopped. Because in the middle of the living room on the floor, he saw something that he just simply couldn't believe. It would turn out the Wu family had performed a ritual 2 days earlier. That was the sounds that the neighbor downstairs had been hearing. Those loud stomping and screaming, all that stuff was a ceremony like the family was known to do. However, that ceremony got totally out of hand. So in the weeks leading up to that ceremony, one of the Wu family's daughters came down with an illness. And because the family didn't have a lot of money, they couldn't send her to the doctor. And after a couple of days, when she didn't get better, the family decided that, okay, well, she must not be physically sick. She must be spiritually sick, meaning she was possessed by a demon. And so at first, they tried some ceremonies to ward off this demon, but it wasn't really working. And then before long, the rest of the members of the family began complaining that maybe they too were also possessed by the same demon. And before long, that was the belief that the entire Wu family shared, that they all were possessed by demons. And so on the day the downstairs neighbor heard all that stomping and chanting and screaming, that was the day that the Wu family performed a big group exorcism to try to get rid of these demons once and for all from all of them. But the way they did this exorcism was truly horrifying. They believed that the one thing demons were afraid of was filth. And so they decided that if they filled their bodies with enough filth, the demons would leave. And so the Wu family, as they chanted and stomped around and screamed, began consuming their own feces. And when they would vomit it back up again, they would just swallow it right back down for hours and hours and hours. What the downstairs neighbor actually discovered inside the living room of the Wu family's apartment was the daughter, the one who originally had gotten sick, and she was laying on the ground and was deceased. And during the autopsy, they would discover that her airway was totally blocked by feces and vomit. By the time the downstairs neighbor made this discovery, the entire Wu family had fled the apartment. Wu Shan had disappeared after saying calling an ambulance, and the rest of the family too had kind of run off. But the police would ultimately track down all the remaining Wu family members and they would all be arrested. However, a court ultimately decided that the Wu family was suffering from something known as mass hysteria. And as a result of that, they could not be held legally accountable for what they did. And so they were all acquitted.
The next and final story of today's episode is called The Helping Hand.
One morning in November of 1997, a police captain named Jeffrey Lewis, along with his partner, parked their squad car near the Manatee River in Bradenton, Florida, which is a small city just south of Tampa. A few minutes earlier, the Bradenton Police Department had received a call from this frantic man who had said he had found something suspicious that had washed up on the shore of this river. And so Captain Lewis and his partner were there to investigate. And so as soon as they got out of their squad car, this man who had called the police, he saw them and waved them down, and he was pointing at something in the sand. And so Captain Lewis and his partner, they walked over, and before they even talked to this guy, they just looked down at what he was pointing at, and right away they could see why he called the police. Because there, sitting on the sand, was a severed human hand. And so the instant Captain Lewis saw this, his first thought was actually just alligators. Because there were alligators that swam in the Manatee River, and people were told about them and were told, not to go swimming here, but people still did. And so his thought was, well, maybe one of the alligators got a swimmer. However, when Captain Lewis looked at the hand more closely, he could tell right away that that probably did not happen. Because where the hand had been cut off from the body, the cut was almost surgical. It was very, very neat. Whereas if an alligator had ripped the hand off, it would be rough. But this almost looked like a surgeon had carefully removed the hand. And so what this signaled to Captain Lewis is this hand very likely represented a murder victim. Somebody who killed this person, cut their body up, and one of their body parts is now washed ashore. And so Captain Lewis turned to his partner and told him to call for backup. And within an hour, police officers were scouring the Manatee River looking for the body that belonged to this hand. Meanwhile, the captain bagged this hand as evidence and brought it to the county sheriff's crime lab, hoping that forensic experts could potentially figure out who the victim was using fingerprints. However, when he actually handed over the hand to these forensic technicians, they told Captain Lewis that it was very likely going to be impossible to try to pull prints from this hand because the hand was very badly decomposed and water damaged. But they told Captain Lewis that despite this being a total long shot, they would still give it a try. And so really all Captain Lewis had was this hand, and so he just kind of waited for information from the crime lab about the fingerprints. And before long, the waiting went from days to weeks to months with no fingerprints. And so with no fingerprints and no other breakthroughs in this case, Captain Lewis moved on to other cases. That is until June of 1998, when Captain Lewis was sitting in his office doing some work, when he suddenly got a call from the crime lab about the hand. An employee told Captain Lewis they had finally made a breakthrough. When they couldn't get the prints off this hand at first, they had moved to this very complicated technique where basically they would peel individual layers of skin off the hand and sort of piece together all the information to get a print. And amazingly, this technique worked. And so not only did they now have this print, but they had also already run this print through the Florida State database and they had gotten a match. The hand belonged to a man named Willie Suttle. As soon as he hung up, Captain Lewis opened up a new tab on his computer and began researching Willie Suttle to figure out who this person was. And he quickly found through public employment records that Willie had been a retired garbage collector, and then also Captain Lewis looked at police records and discovered that Willie had a minor criminal history. But what really stood out in his research about Willie was that Willie had never been reported missing. Willie had instead been reported dead. Right there in the public records that Captain Lewis was looking at, he found Willie's death certificate. And this document said Willie had died of natural causes 5 months prior to his hand washing up on shore. And also it said Willie had been buried in a local cemetery and no police had ever been involved in his death because no crime had been committed. And so Captain Lewis was baffled. None of this made any sense. If Willie had died of natural causes and been buried over a year ago, then how did his hand, his severed hand, wind up on the shore of the Manatee River? The next day, which was Friday, June 26th, Captain Lewis, along with a few other police officers, went to the cemetery where Willie had been buried, and they exhumed his casket. And when they opened it up, they actually expected it to be empty, considering his hand was already missing, so probably his whole body was gone. But no, when they opened it up, there was Willie missing his left hand. But that wasn't all. At the bottom of Willie's casket were all of his internal organs, just sitting there in a rotting pile. And so Captain Lewis is staring at this, having no idea what to make of it, but the first thought he had was, okay, maybe somebody tried to rob Willie's casket. But he's thinking, if they did that, why did they cut out his organs and stash him at the bottom of the casket? And also, why did they remove his left hand and chuck it in the river? That doesn't make any sense. It felt like every clue Captain Lewis found was only making this case harder to solve. But he hoped when he sent off Willie's body to the county medical examiner that they would be able to provide him with some more answers as to what happened here. Later that afternoon, the county medical examiner would perform an autopsy on Willie's body. And the first thing he noticed when he began was that despite the fact that Willie's organs clearly had been removed, that Willie's abdomen did not appear sunken in. It appeared full. So the medical examiner started the autopsy by cutting open Willie's abdomen to see what was in there. And when he saw what was inside of Willie, he just froze, having no idea how to react to what he was looking at. He had never seen anything like this in his entire career, not even close. And so the medical examiner just grabbed a camera, took some pictures of Willie's midsection, and sent those pictures to Captain Lewis. The next day, Captain Lewis sat inside of an interview room in the police station across from a 45-year-old woman named Paula Green Albritton. Paula owned and operated a funeral home along with the help of her son, and she had been the one responsible for Willie Suttle's burial. And so Captain Lewis asked Paula about Willie's burial, and she would tell him that Willie had actually died in poverty, without any family members to help cover his burial expenses. However, when Paula had found out about this, she said she had agreed to do the burial anyways, for no cost, as sort of a community service. However, when Captain Lewis poked and prodded and tried to ask for more information about exactly what that meant, Paula would eventually concede that there actually was slightly more to her rationale behind wanting to do Willie's burial. It was not just for charity. 2 days after this interview, police arrested both Paula and her son. And at Paula's trial, the truth surrounding what happened to Willie finally came out. It would turn out Paula's funeral home business was really struggling, to the point where if she couldn't start generating some real money, her business might go under, and she couldn't have that. And so Paula decided she would conduct a prosperity ritual to right her business. But to perform this prosperity ritual, Paula needed a body. And so along comes Willie Suttle, who's died in poverty and his family can't afford his funeral, and Paula says, "Don't worry, I'll take him on for free." But really what she needed was Willie's body. And once Paula and her son had possession of Willie's body, they began the ritual, which started with Paula's son carefully cutting off Willie's left hand, and then the two of them cut Willie's midsection open, removed all his internal organs, and then Paula got out all these voodoo dolls, and she wrote on pieces of paper the names of the other funeral homes, her competitors in the area, and she pinned these pieces of paper to each of these voodoo dolls, and then she took those voodoo dolls and jammed them inside of Willie's abdomen in the empty cavity they had created, and then they stitched him back up. And then she took Willie's body and his organs and she chucked them into a cheap casket and had him buried. And then she also took the hand that her son had removed, she put it inside of a plastic bag, added some weight to it, and chucked it into the Manatee River. Paula believed this voodoo ritual would literally cause the owners of the other funeral homes, whose businesses she wrote down on the dolls and jammed inside of Willie's body, that this ritual would literally cause all of them to be struck down and killed, putting their businesses out of business, thereby leading to her business prospering once again. However, none of these things came to fruition. The ritual did not work the way Paula intended it to. Instead, the hand that she had thrown into the river ultimately washed ashore, and before long, the police figured out what Paula and her son had done. In 1999, so 2 years after Willie's hand had washed up on shore, Paula and her son were found guilty of desecrating Willie's corpse. Paula's son ultimately served 1 year in prison. As for Paula, her conviction was actually quickly overturned due to a technicality. It was discovered that during an interview with Paula, that police detectives told her that she could not be convicted if this ritual was part of a religious practice, that she was protected under the US Constitution. And so Paula, who confessed to doing this ritual, did so by saying it was part of her religion. She practiced voodoo. And so in court, that confession was ruled inadmissible. And so she walked free.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan.
Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole Lacasio. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast features 2 stories about very dark religious rituals. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Final Act, and it's about a gruesome discovery on a farmer's property in India. The second story you'll hear is called The Metamorphosis, and it's about the ancient Buddhist monk practice of Sokushinbutsu. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the Amazon Music follow button is counting something really important, start shouting out random numbers to mess them up. Okay, let's get into our first story called Final Act. On the evening of April 15th, 2023, a mother and father named Hansa and Himu Makwana stood on the front doorstep of a little shack in a little village in western India called Vinchia. With these 2 parents were their 2 kids, a son and a daughter, who were 12 and 13 years old respectively, and they were really excited because tonight they were going to be spending the night with their uncle and their cousins who lived in this shack right in front of them. And so moments later, the door to this shack opened up, and immediately the 2 kids ran inside, calling out for their cousins. And the uncle who had opened the door, he just smiled and said hello to Himu and Hansa. And the parents, they're calling after their kids to, please behave, listen to your uncle, be good. But they were already gone. And so finally the uncle said, don't worry, they're fine. We'll have a great night. We'll see you tomorrow. And so Himu and Hansa thanked him very much, and then they turned around, they grabbed each other's hands, and began walking out towards the dirt road that would take them back to their own home. The village that Himu and Hansa and their kids and their uncle and their cousins all lived in was a very poor, rundown farming community where, for the most part, people worked really hard but barely got by. But this night, as Himu and Hansa walked along this dirt road, passing by the shacks and tiny apartments and fields and livestock that were kind of all over the place, they weren't thinking about, the struggles of daily life in this village. Instead, they were thinking about how beautiful the village was that night. The sun was starting to set, and so the sky was this beautiful orange, and all the cows that had been out that day kind of wandering around the village were all starting to stand up and make their way back towards their stables for dinner, and with every step the cows made, the little bells on their neck would ring out. And so the scene in front of Himu and Hansa was so beautiful and peaceful that for a moment they just stopped on the road and kind of took in the sights and sounds. And then at some point, a group of cows who were making their way to their stable came up onto the road right where Himu and Hansa were, and very quickly the couple stepped back to make sure no mud or dirt got kicked up on their clothes.
Now, Himu and Hansa were farmers by trade, and so on most days they would wear clothes that were covered in mud and dirt. But this night was different. Himu and Hansa were wearing their finest outfits, and they were not about to get them dirty. Hansa had on her beautiful red dress, and Himu was wearing a starched white button-up shirt. After the cows had crossed the road and suddenly the path was clear again for Himu and Hansa to walk on, Himu paused before taking a step, and he turned and just looked at Hansa. And Hansa, who lately had been feeling quite down, appeared to be very happy and radiant. And so Himu just smiled at Hansa, and at some point Hansa looked up and smiled at him, and then before long they were holding hands again, strolling down the road. A little while later, the couple turned onto their street, and just up ahead on the left side, just off the road, they could see their home, which was a small concrete and brick structure. But when the couple actually reached their property, instead of going in the front door, they walked around their property into the back side where all their crops were. They were growing peanuts and cotton. And Himu and Hansa just walked straight back away from their house through these fields all the way to the very back of their property, which was marked by this huge stone wall that was as tall as Hansa was. And when they reached this wall, they also reached their tent. It was like this patchwork tent they had built with one side being supported by the stone wall, and the other side, the side closest to them as they approached it, was supported by these pikes they had driven into the ground. Inside of this tent was the family's shrine to the Hindu god Shiva. And over the last couple of days, Himu and Hansa had been working on this new addition to the family shrine. It had been a lot of work, but it was finally done, and tonight, Himu and Hansa were finally going to be able to use it. The couple stood outside the tent, taking in the sights and sounds of the beautiful sunset, and then, one after the other, they went inside the tent. The next day, sometime in the afternoon, Himu and Hansa's children returned from their uncle's house after sleeping over there the night before. And when they got to their home, they went in the front door and immediately called out for their parents. But their parents were not inside the house. And so the siblings walked all around the house and then went out the back door thinking maybe their parents were out in the fields working, but when they went outside, they saw their parents were not out there either. And so as the kids stood there kind of wondering where their parents were, the boy said to his older sister, maybe they're in the shrine. So the kids left the back of their house, they cut straight across the field all the way to that back stone wall where they found the shrine, the tent that was propped up against the wall. And right away, the kids noticed something was off about the shrine. Whenever their parents were in there praying, they could typically hear them from a distance as they walked up to the shrine. But now, standing right outside of it, it was totally silent. The kids finally lifted up the flap of the tent, and they looked inside, and once again, they did not see their parents. Instead, what they saw inside of the shrine was totally confusing. The shrine, which their parents typically kept absolutely immaculately clean at all times, looked kind of dirty. There was this weird, rusty-colored liquid kind of all over everything, including on some of the holy objects, like the picture and statue of Shiva. And in the middle of the shrine, where there was this fire pit, were these two hunks of meat that looked like they had been placed in the fire and then forgotten about. The kids knew their parents would never leave the shrine in this condition, nor would they spoil food and let it sit out on a fire and not eat it. And so they're thinking to themselves, what happened inside of the shrine and where are my parents? And then when they did one more look around the inside of the shrine, they noticed something that they had not when they first opened up the tent. And when they realized what it was, they screamed and took off running. This is the story behind what those children saw. The night before, when their parents, Himu and Hansa, stepped inside the tent, they looked around and surveyed the shrine. Right in the middle of the shrine on the ground was that fire pit, and then off to the right side of the fire pit was a small egg-shaped statue that was a statue of Shiva, and then next to the statue was a picture of Shiva. Shiva is a powerful figure in the Hindu religion. He is viewed as a god of both rebirth and of destruction. And when he is portrayed, like in the photo and in the statue that was inside of the shrine, his skin is smeared white with the ashes of corpses. He has crescent moons in his hair, and around his neck are snakes and skulls. And so Shiva is kind of viewed as both a loving, kind god and also one to be scared of. And so after the couple looked around at their shrine for a second, they got to work. Even though that night it was very hot and muggy outside, the first thing the couple did was get some firewood off to the side inside of this tent, put it in the fire pit, and start a fire. And then after the fire was built, Hansa began sprinkling orange flower petals all around the statue and picture of Shiva. And at the same time, Himu got out a piece of paper and began writing a note. And as he wrote, his hand shook with nervous anticipation of what they were going to do that night. And then after Himu finished writing this letter, he and Hansa dipped their thumbs in ink and pressed them to the bottom of this note, kind of like signing the note. And then after the note was complete, they folded it up and tucked it between the statue and the picture of Shiva. Then Himu and Hansa turned their attention to their newest addition to the shrine. The new addition basically just looked like a big door frame, but without a door in the middle of it. It was made out of scrap metal that Himu and Hansa had gathered around their village, and if you were standing in front of this structure, it would almost look like you were looking at a doorway into the fire pit. And also draped over the top of this rectangular frame was a white rope. And so Himu and Hansa moved over right in front of the structure as if they were going to walk through the frame into the fire. But instead of doing that, they knelt down right at the base of the structure, right in the dirt, and then they both, in unison, began to say a prayer out loud. And then after the prayer was done, Himu reached up and grabbed one end of this white rope, and he began pulling it until it was tight. And then he pulled it a little bit more and a little bit more until he had it right where he wanted it, and then he held the rope steady. And then Himu, still holding onto this rope, along with Hansa, very carefully got down onto their bellies, Himu being very cautious not to give any slack to the rope or pull it any farther. And then once they were in position on their bellies, all they would have heard was the crackling of the fire in front of them, and all they would have felt was their hearts beating in their chest. Now, very likely, Himu and Hansa were terrified at this point. But this was their moment. They had come too far, and they knew they had to finish this ritual. And so, with one last loving look at each other, the couple nodded, and then turned their attention back to the fire, and then Himu let go of the rope. The rusty-colored liquid that Himu and Hansa's children would discover inside of this shrine the next day was Himu and Hansa's blood. And the two hunks of meat that their children saw in the fire pit were their parents' decapitated heads. The children realized this was the case when they scanned around the tent one more time and noticed their parents' headless bodies lying side by side at the base of the structure. That was what, of course, caused the children to run outside and go find the police. This new addition to the shrine, the metallic structure, was a homemade guillotine. A guillotine is a device that kills people by cutting off their heads. The white rope that Himu had pulled on was connected on one side to a very heavy metal blade. And so when he was pulling the rope, he was pulling that blade up off the ground until it was positioned right above them, and then he held it steady. And then when he let go, the blade fell straight down, striking the backs of their necks, decapitating them instantly and sending their heads rolling forward into the fire, as designed. When the police arrived at the shrine, they would find that letter that Himu and Hansa had written and then signed with their thumb, tucked near the statue and the picture. And in this note, Himu and Hansa would not give a reason for why they did this, but they would say, "This was our choice, we wanted to do this, we just ask that our living family members take care of our children and our elderly parents." No one has been able to give a reason for why Himu and Hansa intentionally decapitated themselves and then let their heads burn in a fire. Their family has said there was no indication that the couple was going to commit suicide. I mean, they seemed happy, they were not financially well off, but they were not financially struggling either. It seemed like their life was good. And so basically, this whole thing came out of left field. As for the police, they believe that Himu and Hansa must have been performing some sort of black magic ritual where they believed if they lopped their heads off and allowed them to roll forward and burn in this fire, that somehow would bring them closer to perhaps Shiva or some other god or some other higher power. But as of today, no one knows. Our next and final story is called The Metamorphosis. Buddhists believe that human life is a constant cycle of birth, suffering, and then death. And then you're reborn, you suffer again, you die again, over and over and over again, forever, unless you're able to achieve enlightenment, or nirvana as it's called. However, no one really knows what nirvana actually is, what it looks like, what it feels like, where it is. Buddhists will say that the only way to actually understand nirvana is to experience it yourself. It's kind of like trying to describe to someone what chocolate tastes like. You can use any number of superlatives to describe the flavor, but until that person bites a piece of chocolate, they won't really fully understand it. And so, the goal of all Buddhists is to try to attain nirvana. And every day, hundreds of millions of Buddhists all around the world try very hard to do just that. But within Buddhism, there is a small subset of practitioners who have effectively dedicated their entire existence to attaining nirvana. And these people are the famous Buddhist monks. It is extremely difficult to become a Buddhist monk because the sacrifice is enormous. You have to leave your family, your friends, society, all your possessions, your name, your status, everything, and go live in a monastery, which is a kind of isolated place where monks live. And there you will spend your life living this very simple, very strict religious life where basically all you do is try to attain nirvana. As a result of this extreme lifestyle that Buddhist monks live, they have developed a reputation for being some of the most disciplined people on the planet. But even by Buddhist monk standards, their sacred ritual of Sokushinbutsu takes discipline to a whole nother level. Sokushinbutsu was created over 1,000 years ago up in the rugged mountains of northern Japan by a sect of Buddhists called the Shingon. And the Shingon believed that you could attain nirvana through physical punishment. And out of that idea was born the incredibly brutal Sokushinbutsu ritual. In short, Buddhist monks can choose to participate in this ritual, and if they successfully complete it, they might attain nirvana. But they won't know until the ritual is over. Meaning it's kind of like a big gamble. Put yourself through absolute hell, and maybe you have this huge payoff, but maybe not. However, trying to attain nirvana through other means was really difficult. There was no other really clear pathways to nirvana, and so having this one distinct pathway, no matter how difficult it was really appealing. And so since its creation, hundreds and hundreds of Buddhist monks have tried it. And maybe less than 100 have actually successfully completed it. And then of that 100 or less, only 24 have actually attained nirvana through this process. The instructions for Sokushinbutsu are actually quite simple. There are 3 phases. Phase 1 is called Moku Jikagayo, which roughly means tree-eating training. and it's primarily focused on the monk's diet. It takes 1,000 days to complete this phase. However, most monks go much longer than 1,000 days. During this phase, monks will only eat byproducts of trees. Things like seeds, nuts, tree bark, tree roots, pine needles, and they will collect all this food on their own. It should be noted, though, that some monks in this first phase will ingest small rocks. This is likely done because they are starving and they can't find food, and by eating the rocks take up space in their stomach and kind of curb their appetite a little bit, but because they don't actually digest the rocks, they're not technically breaking the phase 1 diet restrictions, and so they can continue on with this ritual. Additionally, during this first phase, the monks adhere to a very involved and strenuous physical exercise routine, and then whenever they're not foraging for food or exercising, they are meditating. At the end of the 1,000th day of phase 1, if the monk has survived, because sometimes phase 1 monks do die mostly from starvation, it is up to them if they are ready to move on to phase 2. This decision ultimately comes down to whether or not, 1, the monk actually adhered to the strict rules of phase 1, something really only that monk would know, and then 2, whether or not the monk actually believes they are spiritually ready to move on to phase 2. Phase 2 is much shorter than phase 1, but it is significantly more challenging. And so the monks going into phase 2, they really need to kind of bring their A game and have no second thoughts. They need to be fully committed to phase 2 in order to successfully complete it. For reference, most of the 24 monks who successfully attained nirvana through this ritual repeated phase 1, 2, or even 3 times just to make sure they really were ready. Phase 2 is called Nyojo, and it roughly translates to deep meditation. But a better way to think about what this phase entails is these monks need to enter into a sort of trance-like state, almost like an out-of-body experience, because what they're going to go through in this phase is so physically uncomfortable that unless you're able to kind of detach mentally, there's just no way to go through with it. And so during the second phase, the monks will sit down and meditate basically constantly for 100 straight days. And during that time, they don't eat any more tree byproducts or rocks. Instead, they have a liquid diet. They drink a little bit of salt water, and they drink a lot of a very particular kind of tea. The tea is made from Toxicodendron verniculum tree bark, which contains the same toxin in poison ivy. Meaning, for phase 2, you basically just sit alone by yourself for 100 days while simultaneously drinking a poisonous tea that causes a massive allergic reaction inside of your throat and stomach that causes an intense itching sensation inside of you that you cannot physically itch. Also, this poisonous tea gives you explosive diarrhea and it makes you vomit a lot. If you somehow manage to survive all 100 days of phase 2, and unfortunately many monks don't, you automatically move on to phase 3. Unlike phase 1, phase 2 never gets repeated, most likely because it almost certainly would be fatal to do so. Phase 3 is either the easiest or the hardest part of the Sokushinbitsu ritual, depending on how you look at it. It doesn't have a name like the other 2 phases, perhaps because so few people make it to this part of the ritual, but regardless, phase 3 definitely has a strict set of rules like the other 2 phases. The phase 3 monk has a small pine box that has no windows built just for them. It needs to be big enough that they can sit inside of it in the lotus pose, which is how they typically sit when they're meditating. And then once it's all built, the monk climbs into this box. They put a lid over the top of it, but they put a bamboo shoot, like a bamboo pole, through the cover of this box. So there is a breathing tube for this monk inside of this box. And then they lower the monk inside of the small pine box 10 feet into this hole in the ground. And then once they ensure the bamboo pole is going to be above ground so they can breathe, they fill the hole in with charcoal. Before we cover what happens next in phase 3, you need some context about what this ritual is actually doing to the monks performing it. Phase 1, tree eating training, serves two purposes. The first is it's kind of like a big gut check. It really shows who wants to do this ritual and who doesn't. It's kind of like if you can't complete phase 1, you certainly can't complete phase 2 or phase 3. So it's like a filter. It weeds out the weak monks. The second purpose of phase 1 is to literally shrink the monk. The tree-eating diet, combined with the constant physical exercise, removes all of their body fat and a lot of their muscle, and so they're incredibly lean by the end of phase 1. And this will be significant when we talk about the end of phase 3. Phase 2, deep meditation phase, serves two purposes as well. The first purpose is that it puts the monk into that trance-like state, and then the second purpose it serves is the toxin inside of this poisonous tea kills off all of the naturally occurring bacteria and parasites inside of the monk. Again, that will become significant when we get to the end of phase 3. Speaking of which, so in phase 3, the monk is put in their box, they're lowered 10 feet into the ground, the breathing bamboo shoot is installed, the charcoal is dumped on top of them, and then for several days, the third phase monk will sit in total darkness and meditate constantly, and each day, they have a bell down there with them. They ring the bell. That's the only thing they have to do besides meditate. And above ground, there is a team of monks that are supporting this ritual, and they're listening for that bell. And the first day they don't hear the bell, it means the monk in the box has completed the ritual, and now it is time to see if they have attained nirvana. In Buddhism, someone whose body does not decay, aka a mummy, is someone who has cheated death. And to cheat death is to remove yourself from the vicious human life cycle of birth, suffering, death, repeat. Meaning, becoming a mummy is a way to attain nirvana. And Sokushin Butsu is a self-mummification ritual. Phase 1 shrinks the monk's body, it removes their fat and muscle, it also removes a lot of moisture inside of their body, and their diet also withholds nutrients to all of the bacteria and parasites that naturally occur inside of their bodies. And so those bacteria and parasites that normally would play a big role in helping decompose your body after death begin to die off. And so the cumulative effect of phase 1 on these monks is that if they were to die at the end of phase 1, their decomposition would be drastically slowed. It wouldn't be mummy status, but it would be close. The phase 2 poisonous tea, that toxin that they're drinking, that kills off the remainder of the bacteria and parasites that did not die during phase 1. Also, all the vomiting and diarrhea completely dehydrates them, which aids in slowing down decomposition after death. Finally, phase 3 is the death phase. The monk goes into their tomb, they're buried underground, and they ring that bell each day to tell the people on the ground that they are still alive. And then when the bell stops ringing, it means the monk in the box is dead. At which point, the crew on the ground removes the bamboo breathing pole and then lets the body sit in the box underground for another 1,000 days. And then after 1,000 days, they pull the box up, they lift the lid off, and if there is little to no signs of decay on their body, it means the self-mummification ritual worked, they're a mummy, they've attained nirvana, and now their body is holy. And so they're brought out of the box, they're dressed in robes, they're placed in the monasteries, and they are worshipped. As for the unlucky monks who get to the end of Sokushin Butsu, but are found to be decomposing inside of their box when they're brought back up again, they're just placed back inside of their pine box and buried, and they are not worshipped. Sokushin Butsu was made illegal in Japan in the late 19th century, but we know monks continued to practice it into the 20th century, and in theory, today, monks still might practice it in secret. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, but many of them are not available on this podcast. They're only on YouTube. Again, the YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Our two stories today are both about people who believed in something so strongly that it informed every single choice they made. And unfortunately for them, those choices led them down very dangerous paths. But before we get into today's two stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the follow button sneezes in public, instead of, politely saying, bless you, just scream, shut up! Okay, let's get into our first story called The Search for Akakor. One afternoon in November of 1980, 28-year-old John Reed sat at a table on a hotel veranda in the tiny village of Barcelos, Brazil, which was a 2-day boat ride up a river from the Amazon jungle's largest city of Manaus. And sitting across from John was the legendary chief of the Uga Mongolula tribe, Tatunka Nara. Now, John had been in Barcelos for about 10 days now, and in that time, he'd already spoken to Tatunka many times. But still, it was like every conversation they had gave John this incredible sense of awe. He really felt like his whole life had been leading up to this exact moment of being here in Barcelos, about to go on this grand adventure. So Barcelos and Tatunka were very far away from where John had grown up. I mean, this was a very foreign place. John grew up in San Francisco, California. But even growing up in those suburbs as a kid, he had always dreamed of coming here and literally meeting Tatunka. So it was like surreal he had really done this. And if things from here on out went the way John hoped they would, he might never have to even go back to America. Because John was on a bona fide quest. John was in Barcelos to be the person who finally found the long-lost city of Akakor. Now, there was almost no record of the city ever actually existing, except for in one book called The Chronicle of Akakor, which was by this author and journalist named Karl Brugger. Karl wrote that Akakor was the capital city of a 12,000-year-old civilization, similar to the Incas or ancient Egyptians, in that they'd lived thousands of years ago and had a big empire and an extremely advanced civilization for their time. But according to Karl, Akakor and its people were way better because they were descendants from actual gods. When the Europeans eventually came to the Amazonian jungle, the people of Akakor did not get wiped out because they went underground. And it was there, underground, that they rebuilt their capital and literally hid their civilization from the modern world. And in fact, the legend said that they actually still live there now, guarding a treasure that had been given to them by the gods. Now, most people called Karl's book complete fiction and said that its author just sort of made it up to make money. But John hadn't paid any attention to the naysayers, and any possible doubts that he had completely disappeared the moment he'd finally met Tatunka. So Tatunka was not only a famous chief who knew the Amazon like the back of his hand, but more importantly, at least to John, he'd actually been interviewed in Karl's book, and he was said to be the one known person who'd actually been to Akakor who was still alive. And here Tatunka was, in the flesh,
sitting across the table from John in all his Amazonian glory. He wore just a loincloth, and he had that same turtle tattoo that the book described, so John knew he was the guy, he was the chief he'd been looking for. And to John, if Tatunka was real, well then surely everything else in that book was real too. Right now though, neither John nor Tatunka were saying anything, which was unusual because normally their meetings were very animated, as Tatunka regaled John with all these amazing stories about Akakor and what it was like there in his very heavily accented English. But hearing these stories hadn't been enough for John, who really wanted to know where Akakor actually was so that he could actually see it with his own eyes. Now, so far, Tatunka had not told John where it was. He'd said that the people of Akakor wanted to stay hidden, their survival depended on it, and so he was not going to give up their location. But today, John could feel that something was different, because just a few minutes ago, John had asked Tatunka again about literally going to Akakor, and now Tatunka had been very quiet for a very long time, like he was thinking about whether or not to finally reveal its location. And so John patiently waited. And as he sat there in this really intense silence, it was like he could almost feel Tatunka's deep wisdom oozing off of him in waves. And then finally, in his soft, very fragmented English, Tatunka began to speak. Almost 9 years later, on an evening in the spring of 1989, John's sister, 35-year-old Sandy Reed, pulled into the driveway of her San Francisco area home and got out of her car to check the mailbox. Sandy had just gotten back from her sales job, and she was tired and bleary-eyed as she, reached into the box and sort of mindlessly pulled out a stack of mail. But as she began sorting through the mail, the return address on one of the envelopes made her stop. It was a letter that was postmarked from Germany, and Sandy didn't know anybody who lived in Germany. And so she really wasn't sure what to expect as she quickly ripped it open. But as her eyes scanned the lines on the page, her hands began to shake uncontrollably. The letter was from a German detective who said that he was writing about her brother, John, and that they were sure something bad had happened to him. So John, Sandy's brother, had gone to Brazil almost a decade earlier to find the lost civilization of Akakor, and Sandy and her parents hadn't heard from him since he left. Now, during the first few weeks of John's trip, he'd written letters fairly regularly, but then his last message had come in late 1980, and after that, nothing. Now, of course, Sandy had been worried about her brother, but she also hadn't been that surprised he had gone radio silent, because Sandy and her parents were well aware that John was obsessed with Akakor, and not just that, he wanted to go on this adventure, find this lost city in the jungle, and then never come home. He wanted to stay in the jungle. And so they kind of figured that, maybe he found Akakor, or maybe he just found another village somewhere. But either way, the way they looked at it is John likely wanted to start a new life somewhere else, somewhere in the jungle, and that's probably what he had done. So for nearly a decade, that sort of became their line of thinking. But now, as Sandy is reading this letter, it was like suddenly her understanding of what was going on with her brother was totally and instantly fractured. Now she was both panicked and also totally confused about the idea that, one, John was in trouble, and two, why is the German police looking for her brother? Why is that happening? Why aren't American police looking for my brother? But as her eyes frantically scanned the page, she learned why. The detective said they were investigating the death or disappearance of John and at least 3 other people, including a German citizen, who apparently had been lured into the Amazon by a particular book about a place called Akakor. Now, this book, according to the detective, was complete junk. It was a fabrication. Akakor, not a real place. But the detective believed that someone was killing the people who came looking for it. Now, the detective said they had tried to investigate, but the Brazilian officials were being very uncooperative, and he wasn't actually allowed to go to Brazil to collect evidence to try to figure out what happened here. And so basically, he was stuck, but he wanted her to know they were looking into her brother. And so by the time Sandy finished reading this letter, she felt like, well, I have to do something. If the German police, if they can't go to Brazil, maybe I can. Sure enough, later that same year, in June, Sandy arrived in the city of Manaus in the Amazon and checked into her hotel. She knew from John's letters from 10 years ago before he disappeared that this was the general area he had been. And so her plan was, sort of roughly speaking, to search the city, turn it upside down, and see what she could learn. Now, obviously, this was a big undertaking. Manaus is a big place. But Sandy, at this point, was all in on this mission. Sandy didn't really know why. For 10 years, basically, she had no idea what happened to John. But it was like now, she felt like she was being called to do whatever she had to do to go find her brother. So she had quit her sales job, emptied her savings account, bought a flight here, and brought along a tape recorder, like an audio tape recorder, so that she would basically, not miss anything, talk to everybody and learn whatever she could and track it. And her plan basically was to just spend all her time interviewing locals, recording what they say, to try to figure out if anybody knew about John or Akakor. But almost as soon as she actually began doing this on the ground in Manaus, she realized how hard it was going to be. I mean, it had been almost a decade since her brother had gone missing. So when she met with the Brazilian law enforcement, they had virtually no details about his disappearance and really couldn't tell her anything useful. And when Sandy spoke to local residents, all she heard were endless rumors with no actual evidence. And on top of that, all the rumors she heard sort of contradicted each other. Some said a white man matching John's description had just recently been seen on the outskirts of Manaus. But then another person claimed John had been shot years ago and his bones had been found deep in the jungle. And then yet another person said, nope, none of that's true. What really happened is John found a tribe in the Amazon, not the people of Akakor, but another tribe, and he had decided to just live with them. Now, even though all this information she was getting was sort of all over the place, there still was one common reaction that almost everybody Sandy spoke to had. Fear. Each time Sandy asked about Akakor, people would sort of clam up, like they were scared of it. Now, they all clearly knew about it, and most of the time when she brought it up, she was warned to sort of leave it alone, like don't talk about that. And that in some ways, looking for Akakor could get her in trouble or even killed. So as the days wore on, Sandy just felt herself feeling more and more confused and anxious. And each night, as she laid in her hotel bed, she wondered if she should just give up, that this was impossible. But then it was like every night after she'd drift off to sleep, she would have a dream about John. It was like he was haunting her. And he would say to her in these dreams that Akakor was not what he thought it would be. So just about every morning when she woke up, she'd have this sort of refound sense of purpose, and she would continue to look for her brother. But it just kept going nowhere. However, during her last few days in Manaus, based basically on finances, like she was running out of money and would have to go home soon, during that time period, she heard another rumor. And that was that John had gone into the jungle to find Akakor, but he hadn't gone in there blind. A local chief named Tatunka had told John how to get there. Now, by this point, Sandy had spent 3 weeks in Manaus and its surrounding areas and really felt completely overwhelmed. I mean, she really hadn't made much progress anywhere. There was definitely a sense of fear around Akakor, and she was even starting to feel that like looking into this could potentially get her into trouble. And in many ways, hearing about this new person, Tatunka, whether they were real or not, it actually made her scared. She would love to learn what he knew, to go find Tatunka and see if he knew where her brother was. But there was also a part of her that just feared even pursuing this lead. It was like all of a sudden, Brazil just felt too overwhelming for her. And so after learning about Tatunka, Sandy's reaction was actually to pack up and leave. But after leaving Brazil, Sandy did not just, fly to California and give up on the search for her brother. She just decided to look for her brother sort of in a roundabout way. She had heard from a local in Brazil that there was a Swiss tourist who might have seen John in the jungle. And so after Sandy left Brazil, she went to Switzerland and spoke to this tourist. And then after speaking with that tourist, she flew to Germany and she met with that detective who had sent her the initial letter she got. But neither the tourist nor the German detective had any new information. So by the end of all that, Sandy still had no answers. And by this point, she also had no money. She had completely drained her savings account trying to find her brother, and it had not worked. Now, Sandy considered just going home. I mean, she was broke, she was scared, and really she hadn't actually gotten anywhere in her search for her brother. But there was still one lead that she had not investigated, and that was Tatunka, because basically it just felt too scary. She'd abandoned it and left for Switzerland and Germany. But Sandy felt like now, if she never went back to Brazil to speak with him, she would never get any real answers. It felt like Tatunka was the key, and she had been cowardly. She needed to go back there. She needed closure. So she went back to America, but she only stayed long enough to earn some quick cash cleaning houses so that she could finance another trip to Brazil. On June 21st, 1990, so about a year after she had made her first trip, Sandy did return to Brazil. She took a small plane to the village of Barcelos, which she had learned was where Tatunka lived. This time, though, she brought some backup with her, a documentary producer and also a reporter. She felt a lot safer coming here with a group, but also she did want to draw attention and resources to eventually help her with her brother's case. When they landed at the rundown airport, Sandy and her small team deboarded and walked straight into the tiny village. In the time that she had been back in America earning cash, Sandy had done some research on Barcelos, so she knew by now that Karl Brugger's book, The Chronicle of Akakor, the book that, John had been so interested in that led him on this quest, had really spawned an entire economy in Barcelos, since tourists came to talk to Tatunka and to try to find it. He was in Barcelos. But as far as Sandy could tell, the tourist boom had not done much for the village of Barcelos. It was dirty and the houses were all very rundown shacks. She'd read that only about 3,000 people lived there, and between all of them, they only had one phone. And so as the group wandered around looking for a friendly face to give them directions, Sandy spotted a woman who was hanging her laundry up on a line outside her home. So Sandy approached her and asked if she knew where Tatunka lived. And the woman immediately nodded, which Sandy expected, because Sandy had not just read up on Barcelos. She now knew a lot about Tatunka as well. And she knew that basically everybody in this area knew his name. He was a renowned chief who'd once led an expedition for the famous explorer Jacques Cousteau. And he was a hero too. One time he had saved the lives of a dozen Brazilian soldiers after their plane had crashed in the Amazon. So the country's secret service was actually in Tatunka's debt. And also, of course, Tatunka was interviewed extensively in The Chronicle of Akakor, that book, and was the only known person who'd actually been to the city and knew its location. But more recently, Tatunka had settled into a quieter life and was running a hotel and giving boat tours to visitors along the Rio Negro. And so Sandy got directions to Tatunka's hotel from this woman, and as Sandy and her team began heading deeper into the village to go meet this guy, Sandy felt a mix of excitement and also fear. There was just something sort of heavy about finally meeting this guy. Eventually, the group came to what appeared to be a very isolated-looking hotel surrounded by a wooden gate. And inside of the gated area, up on the veranda of this hotel, was this very lean, shirtless man with a turtle tattooed on his chest. And Sandy knew immediately from the tattoo that that was Tatunka. As Sandy and her crew opened the gate and walked towards Tatunka, she pulled out a photo of her brother and held it up, along with an explanation of why she was there. And Tatunka, at first, just kind of listened and watched as they approached him, but then as he began to hear what she was saying, he smiled, and in broken English, he told Sandy he was surprised she hadn't come sooner. But Sandy didn't return his smile, because as she stared at Tatunka, all she could think of was how wrong everything was. Tatunka's face, the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, none of it made any sense at all. It would turn out those dreams Sandy was having where her brother John would appear to her and tell her that, Akakor was not like he thought it would be, it would turn out that was correct. Akakor didn't exist. However, it was not just a fake city created by that author, Karl Brugger, to sell his book. No, it was something much, much weirder than that. That whole book was based almost exclusively on the stories of Tatunka, the legendary Amazonian chief who Sandy was now meeting, in front of this weird hotel. But Tatunka, the man standing in front of Sandy, was not chief of anything. In fact, he wasn't even Amazonian. In reality, this man parading around as Tatunka was just some random German man named Gunther Hawk who had fled Germany for the Amazon to avoid paying child support to his ex-wife in the 1960s. But when he arrived in the Amazon, he wanted to blend in, but he didn't speak the language, and he had this heavy German accent. So what do? Well, he created a whole made-up story about a long-lost civilization that he supposedly descended from, Akakor. The Akakor story was designed by this guy just to keep him from having to pay child support. The problem was, the Akakor story, the legend he created, worked too well. Gunther managed to convince local and even national authorities that he was an actual indigenous person. And then, fatefully, he also convinced this writer, Karl Brugger, that he really was from this lost civilization, and sort of inadvertently created an entire tourism industry based on Akakor. And so when Karl's book came out, Gunther found himself in a bind. To keep his tourist revenue stream afloat, he had to keep pretending that Akakor was real and he knew where it was, while also never letting anybody get there. And both Sandy and the German police believe that to protect this secret, Gunther killed any tourists who insisted on actually visiting Akakor, including Sandy's brother, John Reed. Gunther Hawk has never been charged with murder and denies ever hurting anyone. John Reed's body was never found. The author, Karl Brugger, was shot to death in 1984 in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and rumors still circulate about who killed him and why. And as of 2024, Gunther Hawk was confirmed to be alive and still living in Barcelos, and still insisting that Akakor is real. To this day, explorers still travel to Barcelos to try and find it. The second and final story for this episode is called The Parable. On the night of November 14th, 1994, 56-year-old DeWitt Finley drove his pickup truck up a snowy single-lane highway in the Oregon mountains. It was late, but DeWitt was incredibly alert, and it was taking every ounce of his concentration to not crash. It was snowing really, really hard, and the road was incredibly icy. Not to mention, DeWitt was towing a camper van behind his truck, and the van was sort of sliding around and causing DeWitt to feel really unbalanced as he drove. And so as he's driving along, white-knuckling here, all he could think about was how having taken this route was such a bad idea. So DeWitt was a traveling salesman, and he sold fancy camper vans, which was why he had one on the back of his truck, to drive it around from city to city and to show it off to potential new customers. He'd just been in the Oregon coastal town of Coos Bay and was now driving to Grants Pass, which was in the southern part of the state. Now, the drive should have only taken about 2.5 hours, but DeWitt had decided to take a longer, more scenic route that cut through the mountainous national forest. Except that now, instead of experiencing a tranquil, peaceful drive with lush, stunning Oregon scenery, he was stuck in a snowstorm and fighting his way up a steep, heavily forested slope with a cliff on one side. Now, for just about anybody, this would be a harrowing experience. But for DeWitt, he was especially out of his element. He was from sunny Los Angeles, California. He never drove in conditions like this. And he had only very recently moved to Montana this past summer with his fiancée and 2 kids. And while Montana did have some harsh winters, he hadn't experienced them yet. So this was really a novel experience. But DeWitt was a very religious man. And so as this drive was spiking his heart rate and making him so stressed out, he's white-knuckling his way up this pass, all he began to do was just quietly, internally pray. And for a time, this all seemed to work. Maybe the prayer was working. He was staying on the road. He was making his way. He thought, I'm going to get through this. But eventually, the truck began to slide on the slippery conditions, and DeWitt sort of panicked and hit the brakes as hard as he could, which caused the vehicle to slide even more. And then the next few seconds were just a blur of snow and darkness and trees. And then after what felt like an eternity, where he's thinking, oh my God, I'm going to go off the cliff, his truck slammed into a snowbank, keeping him from falling off the cliff. After that, everything went quiet and still. And for a moment, DeWitt just sat there, completely stunned. His heart was hammering in his chest and his whole body was vibrating with adrenaline. But after a few minutes, DeWitt calmed down enough that he was able to kind of assess the situation. Number one, he didn't go off the cliff. So that was a huge win. He survived. And then he checked himself out, and amazingly, he didn't appear to have any injuries. And also, from the inside, it seemed like his truck was okay too. Maybe he dinged up the outside, from hitting the snowbank, but It just seems like he slid off the road and he was basically okay. To DeWitt, this felt like a miracle. He immediately felt like all that praying he had done had worked. God was looking out for him and saved him. However, when DeWitt put his truck in reverse and attempted to drive out of the snowbank, his tires just spun. They couldn't get traction. And so he realized, yeah, I survived the crash, but I may not be able to move. And I am up in the middle of the wilderness of the Oregon mountains. It's snowing like crazy. Like, what do I do? Also, it's the middle of the night. He doesn't have a phone, doesn't have a radio, so he has no way to call anyone for help. He also wasn't expecting to be stuck, by the side of the road, so he didn't have food or water or really any provisions. And he also hadn't seen another vehicle for a really long time. So he had no idea how frequently people use this road, especially in the winter. And also, he wasn't even supposed to be on this route. So if anybody went looking for him, they wouldn't look here. However, just as, panic began to overwhelm him, DeWitt took a deep breath, said another prayer. God had already saved him once, and DeWitt just had to trust that he would do it again. Somehow, DeWitt was able to calm down enough, maybe it was his faith, that he was able to sleep. However, when he woke up, it was clear, one, it's still snowing outside, but worse, it had been snowing clearly all night because his truck was now way more buried in snow. The snow literally made it all the way up to the edge of his window. It's like multiple feet of snow out there. And so DeWitt, he turned his car back on and he threw it in reverse again, seeing if maybe now he'd be able to back out, pretty unlikely, but as soon as he hit the accelerator, the tires clearly spun, he didn't move. Now, it was daylight, and so he's thinking, okay, maybe now I can look around and see a house, a building, or some sign of life somewhere in the distance, just to give me a sense of how close I am to other people. But when he looked out his window, all he could see in every direction were trees and snow. He actually couldn't even see the road anymore and had no idea where it was since he'd gotten all turned around during the crash. And so he's just like in this whiteout, basically. And so DeWitt, at this point, was trying his best not to panic. And so instead, he focused on, what do I have? What supplies do I have right now? And he sort of began looking around the inside of his truck. And he found he actually had a lot of useful stuff in here. There were some cushions and a sheet, so he could make a bed for himself to curl up in. And he could also use the truck's heater to keep himself warm and to melt snow for drinking water. He'd obviously just have to be, careful not to burn too much fuel. Also, DeWitt had the camper that was attached to the back of his truck, which you would think would be great for a situation like this. You can just live in the camper until you get rescued. Except DeWitt knew this was not really a real camper. It was a demo model. It was unfurnished, there was no heat, no supplies, nothing. It was really just a shell, so not that useful. But once DeWitt was done doing this mental inventory, even though in some ways he had basically realized, I have very little, he actually felt a sense of calm come over him. He felt like, what? I have enough to keep me alive for a while, and in that time, I'm going to be found. And so he would just leave it up to God to save him once again. 2 days later, the storm finally let up. But even with the now clear weather, the snow didn't melt. And then soon after that, another storm came and dumped more snow and ice all over his truck. Also, during this time frame, DeWitt didn't see any other cars or trucks or plows. So he had a feeling that the road he had crashed on was now so clogged with snow, it wasn't even usable. But even though at this point DeWitt was extremely hungry, he had no food, it's been several days here, he also was warm and dry inside of his truck. And critically, he was also hydrated. He'd been drinking plenty of melted snow, so he was, surviving as best as he could. And then also, to ward off all the negative, intrusive thoughts about what could happen to him out here, DeWitt had begun to pass the time by meticulously crossing off the days in his yearly planning calendar and also writing letters. DeWitt always carried around pen, paper, and envelopes inside of his work bag, which he obviously had with him. So he had begun writing to the people he loved, his fiancée, his sons, and even to his boss to explain what had happened and why he had missed work. And in each letter, DeWitt did not sound scared or sad. In fact, if anything, he seemed rejuvenated. He seemed happy. He would reflect on how much love and joy was in his life and how lucky he was to have that. And he would tell the people he was writing letters to, like his fiancée and sons, that he really wasn't worried. He knew he was going to be okay. because God was clearly looking out for him. The days turned into weeks, but DeWitt continued to stay warm and basically comfortable and alive, even without any food. But DeWitt believed that his hunger actually was a sign that God was looking out for him. DeWitt had no idea how long somebody could live literally without eating. But after 2 months, DeWitt had tracked the days in his calendar. 2 months had gone by. DeWitt felt like, I should be dead. I haven't eaten in 2 months. But he wasn't dead. And he felt like that was a sign. God was keeping him alive for his eventual rescue. It has to be. On the morning of May 20th, 1995, a teenager, along with his girlfriend, drove up the same mountain road that DeWitt had been on when he got into his accident. And even though it was May, there was quite a bit of snow still, and the road was still quite icy. And about halfway up a particularly steep incline, this teenage kid lost control of his truck. It began to skid, and he went off the road and crashed into a snowbank. Luckily, the teenager and his girlfriend were okay. And for a minute, they just sat there kind of dazed. And then the driver put the car in reverse and tried to move, but the car wouldn't move. The tires just spun. So eventually, the teenager climbed out of the car to examine his vehicle to see if there was serious damage here or if he was just stuck in the snow. But when he did this, when he climbed out of his vehicle, he looked just up the road a ways, and off the side of the road, basically equal to where he was relative to the road, was another vehicle. It was a pickup truck with a camper attached to it that was clearly half buried in the melting snow. And so the teenager told his girlfriend that he was going to go take a look in case, somebody else had a wreck and they needed help. So this kid, he leaves his girlfriend and he hikes over to the truck. And when he gets there, he can't see inside of it. It's covered with too much snow, but he brushes off some of the snow, revealing one of the windows into the truck. And he looked in, and for a second, he couldn't quite see what was in there. But then eventually he saw it. And when he did, he just gasped and backed up. After DeWitt crashed, he was certain he was going to be rescued. He knew he was in an isolated part of this mountain. I mean, he clearly knew that, but he really believed that God was going to save him. He felt like it was God who kept him from going off the cliff, and now God was going to intervene and save him, that somebody was going to show up and rescue him, effectively because of God. So because of that belief, because of how strongly he believed that, DeWitt did not get out of his truck. I mean, he got out maybe to use the bathroom, but for the most part, he stayed in his truck. And unfortunately, had he just gotten out and really looked around, he would have seen there was actually a paved path that, due to the way the winds whip on that side of the mountain, the snow doesn't stick to the ground. And so even with a huge snowstorm, he would have seen a black paved path going down the mountainside, and he could have walked it down to civilization, and it would have saved him. But DeWitt was so convinced that if he just waited here, somebody would save him because God was going to save him again, he just didn't leave his truck. And then when he began to feel that incredible ache from the starvation, the fact that he wasn't dying, months in with no food, it sort of built that resolve inside of him that clearly God has a plan. Clearly. I should be dead right now, and I am not. I need to maintain faith, and I'm going to be saved. And in many ways, that's beautiful. It's poetic in some ways. But it ultimately led to his death. That teenage driver who happened to get into a car accident up on that mountain road, who then saw the truck and the camper, well, that was obviously DeWitt's truck and camper. And when the teenager walked over and cleared the window and looked inside, he saw DeWitt, who was deceased inside of the truck. DeWitt ultimately died of starvation, most likely on January 19th, which is the final day that he crossed off on his calendar. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Story editing by Evan Allen. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Perry Kroll and Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.